The elemental body conveyed the human's findings to the queen, her giant frame sagging slightly with disappointment as a result. "Is there nothing you can do?" the creature asked in a tired, shaky voice. "Not with these eggs." Mickey shook his head. "How long has it been since you laid them?" "A while," the queen admitted after thinking for a couple of seconds. "Do you think a fresh egg might stand a better chance?" "Maybe. There needs to be at least a trace of a soul there to accept my own. Otherwise I have no way to possess them. I've no idea what state they were in the moment you created them, but souls tend to dissipate fast in a dying body." "I can try again," the violet beast offered. "Sure. But we can't afford too many attempts. I don't want you to exhaust yourself to death over nothing, and my friend is almost out of time. If the first few eggs come out like this, I'm going to place her soul in a different body." The queen nodded, accepting his terms. Over the next hour or so, countless smaller wasps swarmed into the chamber, hastily preparing the place for the upcoming operation. They drank the viscous goo from both pits, the sight of them gulping down the green liquid looking quite disturbing. Even worse was the imagery of them crushing the inert royal eggs between their mandibles, consuming them. The objects appeared a lot softer and squishier than Percy had initially thought, their membranous shells bending and tearing with ease. Regardless, he tried not to let this scene bother him too much, even though he was essentially planning to permanently shove his soul into one of these things. "Well, if this is anything like the last time, my mind won't be present in the familiar anyway. If Nephthys is okay with the idea of being reborn as a bug, who am I to judge?" he thought with a shrug. Beyond that, the creatures also carried the live starry breeder eggs out of the room to make space for other things. As soon as the pits were both empty, they took turns vomiting nectar into one of them, filling it up for their grandmother to feast on. By her own admission, she'd been starving herself for a while, for the sake of her hive. Starry queens had to only consume as much mana as they needed to survive and tend to their responsibilities. They couldn't afford to go overboard, or they risked their beast cores progressing toward the next grade, which even the rich environment beneath the fungal spire was unable to support. Sadly, their voluntary fasting left them in a perpetual state of weakness. The good news was that indulging every once in a while shouldn't be enough for the queen to reach white, and she was going to need all the strength she could recover if she wanted to fight against her own body, to overcome the very limits of her species. The nectar her subjects fed her paled in comparison to the royal jelly, but it didn't seem like she had the time to generate her own meal. "She does look a little better," Percy noted at some point. He hadn't realized this earlier because he wasn't that familiar with the bugs, but the queen had been rather lethargic throughout their meeting. This was probably why she'd constantly sounded tired and hadn't moved around much. Thankfully, her hearty meal had made her a lot more energetic already, the golden watermarks and the colorful dots on her carapace shining a little brighter, as even the silver silhouette beneath her exoskeleton surged with renewed vigor. Evidently, the creature had been putting on a brave front the whole time. In hindsight, it didn't seem like Percy and Mickey had been in any danger. The queen wouldn't have been able to take them both on, even if they fought her without pushing the symphony to its limits. Good for her. We should focus on our own preparations, though, Percy thought, returning to the task at hand. Percy hadn't twiddled his thumbs as he waited for the queen to recover. Gathering some soul mana inside the human body's head, he'd wrapped it carefully around Nephthys' wisp, trying to slow down the leakage. Unfortunately, soul stitching wasn't applicable in this situation, as there wasn't much of the goddess's soul left. Worse still, it didn't have any open wounds for him to close, nor anything else to stitch it to. The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. However, he hoped that the soul mana's natural tendency to flood wounds by itself might help a little. He didn't know how much time this would buy him, but he needed every second he could get. On top of that, he'd also resumed mending his own injuries, the stiff, frost-bitten sections on his soul having shrunk further. He still wasn't in great shape, and he doubted he would recover completely anytime soon, yet he wanted to do everything in his power to avoid any unpleasant surprises during the familiar's creation. Finally, he'd taken out his cauldron, working together with the second body to brew a few healing potions. It would be so much faster if we could split up and brew separately, Percy thought with a heavy sigh. Now that they shared their thoughts and memories, including their knowledge of alchemy, and since Mickey's body could theoretically shapeshift freely into a humanoid, they would have loved to split the tool into two identical copies, to brew twice as many potions. Sadly, there were a few issues with that. The elemental body didn't have the Sovereign's eye, so it couldn't use the scaling principle or the oversized cauldron by itself. It should still be able to brew with a regular cauldron, but its output would inevitably be reduced to a mere tenth of the human body's, rendering the whole idea impractical. And that was without taking into account the decreased yield, since the lack of the Atlantean mutation would cost more than just the ability to scale the quantity. If that wasn't bad enough, the human body was still missing an arm, so it needed help to manipulate the countless enchantments on the cauldron. At least, the two bodies were able to coordinate flawlessly, one contributing its eyes as the other lent its limbs. This was completely different from their clunky attempts to cooperate in the past. Once again, it was clear that their recent fusion had turned them into something closer to a single entity than a pair of deeply connected individuals. As for what they needed the healing potions for, well, even if they compressed them twice into green, they wouldn't do much for the Queen. Not to mention that they didn't even have that many gravity herbs left. However, the Starry Princess would be born at Orange, so the standard potions would still be effective on her. Of course, Percy's current goal was to get his hands on a serviceable egg, and it wasn't like the egg itself could drink potions. That said, life mana had the same natural tendency as soul mana to flow to open wounds, only it applied to flesh injuries rather than spectral ones. So Percy hoped that placing the egg in a healing bath might preserve it a little better. While he worked on alchemy, the Queen's subjects filled up the second pit too, though they only dumped dirt in this one. They left just a tiny crater open, barely wide enough to fit a watermelon. This was the spot where the violet beast was going to lay the new eggs. As soon as he was ready, Percy walked up to the hole, emptying enough of his recent brews to fill it up with another type of green liquid, this one shining brighter than the Queen's goo. Having prepared herself too, the colossal bug stepped carefully over the hole, lowering her abdomen close to the opening. Percy had to duck, to avoid getting accidentally impaled by her enormous stinger. The base of the darn thing was as thick as a tree's trunk, though it led to a narrow tip sharp enough for a person to easily prick their finger on. Admittedly, her control over her venom glands was commendable. Percy hadn't forgotten about the Starry Night's stinger dripping with acid during his previous visit, yet not a single drop seemed to leak out of the Queen's stinger without her explicit wishes. Either way, none of that mattered right now. "I'm ready if you are," the creature told Mickey as soon as he re-established their connection. "Give me a few seconds. I need to prepare my bloodline too," he replied. Coating his fingertips in mana, Percy grabbed his soul with his one good hand, pulling out a portion of the gray silhouette sitting inside his head. With it, a broken pyramid emerged, the crimson structure having almost snapped into two pieces by now, its once glossy faces now dim and riddled with cracks. Ignoring the tapestry of colors hovering right above his eyes, Percy used his family's technique, sending waves of soul mana rippling through his body. The gray substance bounced countless times along the fluctuating surfaces of his soul before flowing into his head. The mana accumulated flawlessly inside the blob, causing it to expand greatly with each forceful throb. Suffice to say, Percy had grown quite proficient at this over the years. His efforts already resembled Baldy's, though his version of the bloodline thankfully required less time to activate. That was only to be expected, since he only had to fill up a tiny piece of his soul with mana, rather than slowly generating an exact replica of his whole body. Of course, the soul variant of the bloodline had its own share of drawbacks, but Percy's limited clone capacity and the strain the ability put on him didn't affect the current situation much. He only stopped once the wisp in his palm had reached the size of a grapefruit, at which point he estimated that it couldn't stretch much further without damaging the pyramid more than was acceptable. "Do it," he told the Queen, watching with bated breath as she began the process. The violet wasp had obviously laid countless eggs in her life, since populating the hive was one of her most important responsibilities. Naturally, she had to be quite experienced at this, at the very least. There was no doubt in Percy's mind that producing a starry breeder's egg was downright effortless for the queen. Giving birth to a new descendant, however, was clearly as far from effortless as anything could be. Through their connection, he felt the strain on her soul, her entire body convulsing. The colorful dots on her exoskeleton shone brighter than ever before, as even her core went above and beyond, pumping so much beast mana into her circulatory system that Percy thought for a second that she was going to activate a boosting art by mistake. Flashes of golden light traveled across the watermarks and toward her abdomen, converging along with the mana at the hole right beneath her stinger. Just when Percy was starting to question whether she'd lost the ability to even produce the eggs, the queen pushed herself one final time, causing the markings and her channels to flare with unprecedented power. This lasted for just the briefest of instants, a tiny sphere soon popping out of the hole and into the crater on the ground with a wet squelch. Percy's features couldn't help but twist into a grimace as he fought to suppress his disgust. Between him and Mickey, they'd accumulated 3 lives' worth of memories. Yet the universe apparently still held some rather nasty surprises for them. Pushing the distracting thoughts aside, he focused his multifaceted vision onto the egg, desperately searching for signs of life. Nothing. He spat through gritted teeth upon failing to spot the slightest trace of silver inside the round object. He would have clenched his fist in frustration if he wasn't worried about crushing the fragile pyramid still floating inside his palm. Either way, this didn't bode well. If even a fresh egg was completely inert, Percy wouldn't be able to help the queen. Still, he'd promised her to try a couple of times, so he wasn't going to quit after the first setback. Turning his attention back to the violet creature, he noticed that her soul and markings had dimmed once more. Clearly, producing the tiny egg had taken a lot out of her. "I'm sorry. The first one is a failure," Mickey told her, feeling a pit form in his crystalline stomach as he sensed her despair. She remained silent, however, commanding her subjects to refill the larger hole with nectar. Knowing that she was going to need longer to recover a second time, Percy drained the humming orb of most of its mana. He had to reduce its internal pressure, as it was starting to accelerate the pyramid's decay. The structure couldn't possibly survive for several hours with the wisp filled to the brim with mana, and Percy didn't want to risk moving it into and out of his body again. Standing motionless over the pit, he waited patiently for the queen to prepare herself. This time, she took about 4 hours, and Percy could tell that she hadn't even recovered fully. Evidently, forcing her to lay multiple royal eggs in quick succession wasn't the most optimal way to do this, but the pyramid's deterioration didn't afford them the luxury of delaying. Unfortunately, a similar situation repeated itself shortly afterwards. The sight of another dead egg popping out of the queen's body caused Percy's heart to sink and his fleeting hope to evaporate. After 2 failures and paying such a hefty price for her efforts, the odds of the violet beast succeeding the next time had to be even lower. She probably understood this too, but Percy was going to give her one last chance if she insisted. Preparing for the 3rd attempt took the queen close to 6 hours. Leaving Percy's wishes aside, it was clear by her appearance that this was going to be their final shot. Trying a 4th time wouldn't just be ineffective. It might be dangerous. Her soul was flaring erratically as her core's brightness fluctuated. And this was before she'd even started. "Your Majesty, no matter what happens, I won't allow you to try again," Percy said. The last thing he wanted to do was to discourage the creature, but he knew it was time to douse her with a dose of reality. Unless he adopted a hard stance early on, the wasp might insist on self-harm. Nodding dejectedly, the queen began the process once more. This time, Percy could sense her anguish as she squeezed every drop of mana out of her thorax and into her abdomen. The violent flow of energy caused her channels to swell and burst, ravaging several organs in its path. Her carapace cracked in many spots, green blood oozing out of the holes as the golden patterns on her exoskeleton nearly turned white. This was it. The queen was clearly determined to pour everything into this egg, no matter the cost. Watching her, Percy was tempted to stop her, afraid that she was going to kill herself. Gritting his teeth, he allowed her to continue against his better judgment, however. Whatever gamble she was taking, this was ultimately a leader's responsibility. to do everything necessary to give their subjects a future. In a way, the queen's determination reminded Percy of Nephthys' sacrifices. Even now, her dormant wisp continued to protect the Amenthei, refusing to let go. This only reinforced Percy's view that the Starry Princess was the perfect match for the goddess's soul. Assuming this works, he thought, swallowing hard. Otherwise, they both lose. And so do I, as well as all of Remir. Percy watched with bated breath as the third and final egg emerged out of the queen's body. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the small object plunged into the pool of healing fluid with a soft plop, slowly sinking to the bottom. Percy's gaze remained glued to the sphere. Ignoring the layer of orange mana inhibiting his mana sense, he focused entirely on his soul vision. Just as he feared that this was going to be another dud, he spotted, to his unimaginable elation, the faintest spark of silver, rapidly dimming inside the egg. Traces of life mana were trying to seep into the object in an attempt to preserve the weak life housed within, though it was clearly a losing battle. Unwilling to waste the precious chance that the queen had so bravely created, Percy activated his bloodline, allowing the ghostly claw to enter the gray orb attached to his head. The claw twisted the wisp, causing the pyramid to shatter into half a dozen pieces. Percy's soul mixed violently with Nephthys, as well as the countless silver dots glinting inside it. Naturally, Percy had no idea whether any of them would survive the process. Even if the goddess did, he wasn't even sure what she had expected to happen to the dying mortals. Each of them was in a far worse state that Mickey had been in, so the best-case scenario would be for them to merge with her, becoming a part of the emerging familiar. It was far from a promising fate, but Percy knew that this was the best Nephthys could have done for her people under the circumstances. A loud snapping sound echoed through his soul as the claw tore the wisp off. Percy managed to lean over the pit just in time to aim his forehead toward the egg, watching the gray comet shoot into it in an instant. The shock of his severed soul no longer affected him as much as it used to, so he was able to retain his senses to observe the process. The wisp entered the egg successfully, wrapping itself tightly around the fading spark. So far, so good, Percy thought, exhaling in relief. Obviously, this was just the start of Nephthys' battle, but they'd already overcome many of the most serious hurdles. Unlike its siblings, this egg had definitely come out possessing a soul, and it had to still be alive in there, otherwise the others would have had nothing to latch on. On top of that, Percy knew how malleable newborn souls were, so the spark had likely already began fusing with the rest, gluing Nephthys and Percy's souls together in the process. Still, it was difficult to tell with certainty what was happening in there. The bundle of souls rolled violently inside the orb, its components twisting one another into the world's ugliest yarn ball. Whether it would stabilize in the end into something capable of hatching remained to be seen. What happened? Did this go any better? The queen's voice rang through the elemental body. It was soft like a whisper, betraying her pain and exhaustion, though an unmistakable hint of hope bled through her words for the first time in several hours. Not that Percy could blame her. Well, Your Majesty, the two of us have already done everything we could, Percy replied, plopping down weakly. The rest is up to her. No matter what, Percy had no regrets. He'd already warned both the Starry Queen and Nephthys of the risks, and they'd agreed to go through with this regardless. On top of that, he'd managed to do everything he'd promised, bringing everyone to a single step before the very end. Still, tossing another glance at the Battle of Silver, crimson and gray raging on inside the tiny egg, he couldn't help but pray silently to the Amenthei goddess for her success. The fate of not just one, but two worlds was counting on her. Tired as he was, Percy couldn't help but keep his eyes glued to the egg during the first couple of hours. The bundle of souls rolling inside the obsidian orb calmed down after a while, showing no immediate signs of collapsing, which had to be a good thing. It was still a mess in there, of course, and the familiar soul had no defined shape, making Percy question whether something had gone terribly wrong with the operation. Then again, he didn't have anything to compare this to, since he had been unconscious during the early moments of Mickey's creation. Only now did he realize that passing out the previous time might have been a blessing in disguise. At least it had spared him from all this worrying. "Stop staring at the egg," the queen suggested at some point, her words coming out soft and strained. Her body was still covered in injuries from head to stinger, though she had survived the ordeal. Her subjects had already refilled the hole in front of her with nectar twice, the sumptuous meal having improved her situation slightly. Percy had no idea how much of her lifespan remained after producing all those royal eggs that she had never been supposed to lay. Still, he very much hoped that the creature would be around for a few more years at least, to mentor her successor. "I'm anxious to know the result too, but even a regular starry princess takes a while to hatch. Watching it the whole time will only drive you crazy," she continued, oblivious to his thoughts. Percy nodded, though he still pressed the violet beast for a more concrete time frame. Sadly, the mismatch between human and wasp timekeeping methods got in the way again. The queen did have eyes and antennae in the outside world, so she wasn't entirely unfamiliar with the concepts of days and nights, but she apparently preferred to estimate durations by referencing various biological processes inherent to her species. After some back and forth, Percy concluded that it would be at least a couple of weeks until the egg was done incubating. It wasn't that long, but he'd inevitably have to find other things to keep himself busy. Nephthys didn't seem to be conscious yet, as she failed to respond to any of his transmissions. Even so, he kept feeding her morsels of soul mana through the cord, and regularly replenished the healing bath the egg was in, to hopefully improve her odds. Other than that, there wasn't much else that begged for his immediate attention, which led him to another realization. "I'm free." For the first time since forever ago. As long as he could remember, it had been one deadline after another. Years of hunting, studying, and brewing in the guild to meet his and Mickey's needs, followed by even more years of planning to infiltrate House Tantalus. And things had only gone downhill from there. Acton, the race to the next grade, the bounty hunters, the wasp familiar. It had been decades since Percy last had a moment to relax. Granted, it wasn't like there was nothing left for him to do. Just off the top of his head, he still had to break Baldy and Orin out of their prisons, send out more clones, work on his artificial advancement, figure out the situation on Remir, help out House Avalon, and deliver the affinity-changing treasures to the girls. That said, none of those things was terribly urgent. The treasure would last years, and none of his pursuers would consider searching for him in the depths of the hive. In theory, there was nothing wrong with him and Mickey taking a short vacation as they waited for Nephthys to hatch. Well, okay, I can still spend this time productively, but that doesn't mean it can't be fun. The line between training and entertainment had always been blurry for Percy, as he didn't really dislike any of the things he normally spent his time on. He genuinely enjoyed alchemy and runecrafting, and was passionate about developing his spells or coming up with new ways to get stronger, even if some of those methods got a little unpleasant every now and then. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. What he wasn't always a fan of was how much pressure he was in to do everything in the most optimal way, micromanaging every second of his life. Not that he regretted making a few sacrifices to move faster toward his goals, but the thought of setting himself loose for a few weeks sounded nice. Mending our soul is still a priority. Those stiff patches are rather uncomfortable. The rest is more negotiable, though. Percy definitely wanted to do some alchemy during his break. He still had plenty of Aurora Dew left, and he didn't think that he'd have much trouble acquiring nectar or royal jelly in the future now that he'd forged new ties with the starry wasps, so he wasn't interested in doing anything elixir-related at the moment. Instead, he wanted to focus on something simpler and more relaxing. "I'll just brew some regular healing potions." He didn't need that many of them, but the product itself wasn't the point of the task. Extracting potions from a single ingredient was about the easiest thing an alchemist could work on, and this was a recipe he was intimately familiar with. He could just turn his brain off, slowly digesting his gains from the past few weeks. The experience was bound to be 100 times more pleasant without a tight quota he had to meet, or limited ingredients he had to be mindful of. He still had a ton of green mushrooms, and the queen would probably be fine with giving him a few dead wasps to plant more ingredients on if he asked. It's about time to master the cascading cracks technique too, he remembered. Reducing his elixir consumption hadn't been a priority lately, and it wasn't going to become one anytime soon, given his current circumstances. However, that only applied to him personally. Assuming that everything went well with the new familiar, Percy was planning to start giving back to Remier, forging new alliances and mending broken bridges. A technique that could have everyone's elixir consumption would make for a great peace offering. Working on the painful technique didn't exactly fit with the spirit of his vacation, but he didn't think much of it, because he couldn't spend more than a few minutes per day cleansing his cores anyway. Between him and Mickey, they had a total of 3 cores that had to be cleansed thrice a day, so it shouldn't take them too long to perfect the technique. Percy had already laid most of the groundwork for it on Thescala. Combining it with his whirlpool of 4 streams would take a little longer, especially since he could only practice that using his human body, but his increased mental acuity should help with that too. I should also start sending clones again, he thought, adding another item to the agenda. He'd kept the cords available for the infiltration mission, but that was no longer necessary. Sadly, half of his slots had somehow ended up occupied by Mickey and Nephthys, and that was without counting a potential 4th cord that he might need to tie up into the Wasp familiar at some point. Even so, there was no question that fusing with Mickey had been worth losing a couple of cords. Percy was sure that the Wasp familiar would pay for herself too. Leaving aside all the sentimental and political reasons he had for helping Nephthys and the Starry Queen, the royal jelly alone was precisely the sort of treasure he generally had his clones searching for. As limited as the resource was, he was confident that he'd find a way to take advantage of it. In a way, the clone he had just placed inside the egg was one of the most successful yet, regarding his long-term goal of attaining divinity. That said, I should stop creating new familiars for another grade or 2, or I'm going to run out of cords for regular clones. 3 would have to do for the time being, and Percy was going to give them some time off too. Seeing as he was currently in the mood for a vacation, he decided to ease up on his orders a little, allowing the clones to do whatever they wanted. After all, there was close to a 90% chance that he'd end up as one of them by the time he severed the 3rd of them off his soul. Rather than embarking on high-stakes missions involving treacherous blues and scheming titans, he'd much rather go on a few whimsical adventures for a while. That meant that he wasn't going to look for greater or lesser springs in the next few weeks. Finding them took too long anyway. With everything settled, he had both of his bodies sit cross-legged across from one another, taking a few minutes to activate his bloodline a couple of times, producing the clones. As soon as he was done, he took out his cauldron and tossed a few green mushrooms in, commencing a new brewing session as he resumed mending his soul. If he got lucky, one of his throwaway clones might find something interesting in the next couple of weeks, or his main bodies might improve their brewing yield by the time the new familiar was ready. Either way, he knew that this break was ultimately good for him. A few days earlier, unbeknownst to Percy, there was an ancient, wise, and arguably pretty pair of eyes watching his every move. In fact, learning how long these eyes had been observing him would likely send a chill down his spine. Admittedly, spying on the boy wasn't Phoebe's classiest move, but it couldn't be helped. Percy was just too important to leave alone, and this was the only way to prevent any accidents from occurring. Save perhaps for making her presence known and sheltering him directly, but that would inhibit his growth. He's improving faster than I expected. I really thought he would have slowed down by now, she muttered as she watched Percy and the crow take down another group of bounty hunters. It had only taken the boy a couple of years to go from barely beating Acton to handling multiple blues by himself, and even more with help from his familiar. Phoebe had initially thought that reaching yellow and upgrading his boosting art would have marked the end of Percy's rapid growth, but he hadn't stopped surprising her over the past few months. At this rate, he might actually get to where she wanted him by the time he reached violet or even blue. Of course, Phoebe hadn't always been invested in the boy's personal strength. At first, she'd been far more interested in other aspects of his bloodline. She'd registered an anomaly as early as during his evaluation at the temple, though she hadn't thought much of it at the time. She could have never imagined that a mortal's bloodline or spell would be capable of bypassing the powerful enchantments in the assessment centers to steal her mana. And, well, she had been right about that. Percy had caused the incident indirectly, by bringing one of the most powerful decrees in existence back to Remier and letting it feast upon the Crimson Pool. That said, Phoebe hadn't pieced together the details until years later. Sadly, omniscience was an ability that not even the most powerful gods in the universe could dream of possessing. Despite being the originator of the status, she could only read another person's page while looking at them. The most logical explanation at the time had been that too many children had arrived at the temple. She'd figured that the lazy priests and priestesses working there must have grown impatient with the long queue, having the children undergo their affinity tests in batches. They weren't supposed to do that, of course. Phoebe had explicitly told them many times that the presence of multiple evaluees could interfere with the quality of the assessments or make the children feel uneasy. Still, this wouldn't have been the first time the dumbest of her subordinates disobeyed her, thinking that she wouldn't notice. Things like that were inevitable, since the personnel working at the temples weren't even official members of the root, let alone the order. They were simply volunteers from other noble houses that had been sent by their families to carry favor with the gods. If the root could be considered the order's outer circle, the people at the temples were barely in the periphery of the organization. Not that it had mattered much. The mind mana had returned to its previous level within hours, and Phoebe had been more than happy to brush the short-lived hiccup aside, going back to her business. It wasn't until news of the revolutionary Aurora Dew reached her ears a few years later that she'd gotten involved with Percy again. Learning about the culprits hiding in the Alchemist's Guild, she'd allowed the root to apply pressure on them, mostly to observe how they would react, to gain a better grasp on their personalities and motivations. However, she'd ordered the other gods to stay out of it until she knew what they were dealing with. Scanning the fungal spire, she'd searched for the ones responsible, spotting Percy and his friends as they emerged from the underground tunnels, all battered and covered in wasp blood. As tempted as she had been to reveal herself and chastise them for their recklessness, she'd ultimately held back, opting to continue observing the mortals silently. A couple of young people with orange and yellow cores couldn't have damaged the hive much anyway. They'd likely just passed through the tunnels in their desperation, barely surviving the ordeal. Over the following weeks, Phoebe had kept her eyes on them, trying to better understand the miraculous bloodline that had made everything possible, and to decide the best way to deal with the boy. Percy's strength hadn't been a factor worth considering just yet, though many other things about him had piqued her interest outside of the elixirs. The fact that he'd managed to develop a functional second core had been at the top of the list. The stolen decree would have been little more than a curiosity had it been limited to Percy, but seeing how he had successfully transferred and germinated the seed in the crow's body had given Phoebe hope that the act could be extended to more people, something that she'd eventually confirmed. Beyond that, the crow was a marvel of magic in and of itself. Every lesser spring in the universe dreamt of ways to control and foster powerful beasts, to use them as disposable pawns in their expeditions. The creatures could grow much faster than sapients, and they could do so without consuming a single drop of elixir. On top of that, their lives weren't particularly valuable, so they would make for the perfect foot soldiers to sacrifice in place of their precious greenborns, provided that they found a way to suppress their hunger and rebellious nature. Having white or clear beasts wasn't as important for Greater Springs, since most were too powerful to care about a few additional demigods, and no world but Xixiong had ever produced divine beasts. Even so, Remier could still very much benefit from them. This was why the Order had wasted so much time and resources to support House Parnassus, hoping that one of their descendants would mutate a usable version of their bloodline, though their millennia-long efforts had yet to bear any fruit. Perhaps Percy and his crow could open another avenue for them, assuming that the bloodline could be passed on, and that his familiars showed no flaws down the line. Other than the Morais decree, the bird, and the Aurora Dew, the only things that had stood out the first time Phoebe had laid eyes upon Percy's status had been circulation and Metatron's decree. The former was another precious gift that she had hoped to eventually spread across Remier, while the latter had given her pause, making her realize that letting Percy roam the universe was inherently dangerous. Not wasting time, she'd planted a mental obstruction in his mind that would prevent him or his future clones from ever activating the decree on Remier. To this day, the boy had yet to notice its presence, because he'd never even considered doing anything that foolish. It only spoke volumes to how intelligent and responsible he was. Clearly, He also understood how risky it would be to place his life in Metatron's hands, or to give the Titan access to his world. Even so, Phoebe had never regretted taking measures to stop him. Desperation could drive anyone into making all sorts of reckless decisions, and this was the one thing that she could never allow Percy to do. Leaving that aside, Phoebe had been more than satisfied with the boy's conduct. Being born with a unique bloodline hadn't been under his control, but not many people in his shoes would have used it as well. Most young nobles might have stopped after the first couple of successful clones, leveraging their gains to elevate their status in their families, indulging in a life of luxury and worthless pleasures. Not Percy, though. Phoebe couldn't have asked for a better owner for the bloodline. In fact, his ambitions compelled him to constantly aim higher, his morals tempering his decisions with kindness, patience, and caution. His work ethic prevented him from wasting a single moment of his life, and his cunning allowed his clones to return with valuable gains more often than Phoebe had thought possible. I don't even need to step in, she'd realized. Evidently, Percy didn't require her help or her guidance. He was doing everything she would have wanted him to do all by himself. She merely had to sit back and document his discoveries, keeping track of those that could be useful for their world, while looking out for any hidden dangers. Studying Ie's decree, and years later, Obatala's, had been especially useful due to their overlap with her own. Phoebe didn't think that she'd be able to replicate the extraneous elements, the mutated eyes, or the ability to lock one's domain in its strongest state, unless Percy found a way to dig the buried potential out of his soul and grant the missing features to his clones, like he did with the second cores. However, the way in which the decrees had restructured Percy's status was something Phoebe could learn from. The adaptability of her creation was one of its most important qualities, but also a prelude to a much more useful feature that she'd always planned to eventually incorporate into it. Sadly, her research in that area had hit a wall thousands of years ago. Thankfully, Percy's bountiful harvest had already given her a lot of much-needed inspiration to resume working on her grand project, something that not just Percy, but everyone on Remir would soon benefit from. Well, my soon. That is, she thought, scratching her head. From their perspective, it'll be quite a while before it's ready. Other than the decrees, Percy had brought plenty of other valuables back. Phoebe had never even heard of spectral traits. Admittedly, it appeared that they could only be absorbed by soul affinity users, but they did have a couple of those in the order, including a demigod, so the knowledge should prove useful. Reinforcement would also help everyone with a pure affinity, and they had a lot more of those. Or, they used to, at least before giving most of them a petal. Either way, they would certainly receive several affinity-less holy children in the future. Many of the alchemic principles Percy had mastered would also prove handy, as would the advanced runecrafting knowledge. Phoebe had chosen not to butt in Percy's dealings with the sentient ring of sacrilege or the goddess slumbering in his soul, having grown to trust the boy's judgment after watching him for so long. More importantly, however, Phoebe had slowly started to appreciate how well Percy had integrated all of the disparate pieces of magical knowledge that he'd acquired into his arsenal. During his time in the valley, she had fully expected him to get his ass handed to him by Acton, forcing her to jump in to save him. Revealing herself wouldn't have been ideal, but it would have been better than letting him die. Yet Percy had shocked her once again, upgrading his boosting art and re-establishing his previously demonstrated ability of fighting 2 grades above his own, despite the lack of a domain that should have made bridging the gap exceedingly difficult. Before that fight, Phoebe hadn't expected Percy to jump grades like that until Blue. Even once he did, it wouldn't have made that much of a difference, as his bloodline was best applied to the betterment of Remir as a whole than powering up a single Redborn. Or so she had thought. The revelation had finally made her realize that the boy held even more potential than she'd initially given him credit for. All of a sudden, Percy's strength had become one of his most valuable assets, a talent worth cultivating. If only he could stay on this trajectory for a few more grades, he might grow strong enough to fight against gods one day, while still being immortal, thus opening countless new doors for their world. Even better, Phoebe's recent observations had only confirmed that Percy was still steadily traversing this impossible road. This was precisely why she found Deimos's sudden intrusion so annoying. That petty little shit, she cursed, seeing through the man's true grade at a glance. It wasn't a huge secret that Hermes's youngest son had serious insecurities, but she hadn't expected him to stoop so low as to hide his promotion from everyone for years, just to punish Percy for all the attention he was getting. But here they were. Unfortunately, Phoebe couldn't see a way out of this mess for the boy. As strong as he was, the gap was too wide for him to escape or win, and she'd already sealed his final trump card away. Unless she stepped in, her golden goose was going to die today. As expected, Phoebe watched Deimos toy with Percy and the crow, effortlessly ripping them apart. Seeing the violet preparing to finish the boy off, she knew that her time to interfere was quickly running out. Yet, just as she was about to step in to save him, the broken familiar leapt in the way of the blast, clearly intending to sacrifice everything to protect its master. The sight made Phoebe hesitate, thinking that letting Deimos destroy the crow first might not be a terrible idea. She didn't want to do that, of course. She wasn't heartless. She'd grown rather fond of Percy and Mickey after observing them for so long. The bird's willingness to give up its life to save the boy was especially moving, and the thought of letting either of them suffer didn't sit well with her. Even so, she felt that it was better this way. She wasn't their mother, she was the Order's leader and Remier's primary protector. Her duty was to their world before any of its people, and the upsides of letting the crow perish greatly outweighed the downsides. This was quite a strange dilemma, but one that she'd been contemplating for a while. In anybody else's hands, the powerful familiar would have made for a priceless asset, the realization of the Order's ambitions for Acton's family over the last several thousand years. Had someone told Phoebe that she was going to willingly allow a creature like Mickey to die before her eyes one day, she would have burst out laughing. However, Percy's unprecedented growth had greatly shifted her perspective over the years, making her value his development more than many of his other achievements, the creation of a controllable beast included. Simply put, Mickey had always been more of a liability for the boy than an asset. Just thinking about it was crazy, but there was no denying it. On the surface, the crow had done an excellent job keeping up with Percy's strength and aiding him in his ventures. Any outside observer could be excused for thinking that Mickey's contribution to their team was equal to Percy's, as the bird essentially doubled the boy's fighting strength. Phoebe was wise enough to peer a layer deeper than most, scrutinizing the long road that had led them to the present moment. The crow has been holding him back from the very start, she'd concluded. Percy was probably smart enough to see it too, though his loyalty to his friend had blinded him all this time. Not only had the bird consumed enormous amounts of resources and attention to reach its current level, but its existence had also forced Percy to make numerous reckless decisions. He'd traveled to suboptimal places to train, taken unnecessary risks for the sake of his familiar, and even picked a fight with a holy child. If it hadn't been for Mickey, Percy might have stayed in the Alchemist's Guild the whole time, hidden from everyone, including Phoebe. The only reason he'd put himself out there had been the urgency to earn enough resources to support the crow. On top of that, there was an even greater disadvantage to owning a familiar: Percy's limited clone capacity. For the longest time, he'd only been capable of maintaining 2 connections, one of which had been permanently occupied by the crow. Even after increasing his limit to 6, the boy had foolishly chosen to tie up a second clone to the bird, thus leaving a third of his total capacity unavailable to this day. That was without even considering the second familiar that he was clearly planning to create. Phoebe couldn't help but wonder how much stronger Percy would have grown had he focused his efforts on bettering himself over the past couple of decades. Looking back, she had to admit that Percy hadn't made that many outrageous mistakes in the time that she'd observed him, but the biggest ones could all be traced back to that first mistake: Mickey's creation. That was not to say that she was opposed to the idea of familiars in general. They were certainly an important feature of Percy's bloodline, as well as valuable assets to Remier as a whole, especially if they could be mass-produced. They could revisit the topic in the future. Perhaps the best time to do that would be after a few thousand years, once Percy was done picking all the low-hanging fruit waiting for him out there in the cosmos. As soon as his progress slowed down, they could have him tie up a clone or 2 to forge a couple of powerful companions. The creatures grew rather fast, so it wouldn't be too late to start over. If you stumble upon this tale on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Now was too early, however. Stinting his growth so early in his journey was inefficient. Phoebe was willing to bet that Percy would have been far stronger if he hadn't missed out on hundreds of potential clones due to Mickey. Also, I'm sure that he can do a lot better than the bird. Phoebe hadn't witnessed the familiar's creation, but it was quite clear that Percy had simply shoved a random mortal soul into the first available body, without even understanding the implications. Sure, he'd taught the crow a few useful spells since then, and even invested a petal to grant it a composite affinity, but none of its abilities was particularly impressive. In many ways, what Percy was obviously planning to do with the goddess's soul and the starry wasp was 100 times more promising now. That was an experiment that Phoebe was interested in watching, excusing, and even wholeheartedly supporting. Even if Percy decided that he needed more familiars in the future, she could help him pick unique souls and useful bodies to pair together. In fact, she was more than happy to let him try several times, until they stumbled upon a familiar lucky enough to awaken a rare affinity. As for Mickey, it was painful to admit, but Percy was better off getting rid of him. Since he wasn't going to do that by himself, Phoebe could just let Deimos do it for him. Watching the crow's head burst open left a bad taste in her mouth. It was cruel of her to allow this, but making the tough decisions that nobody else was willing to entertain was ultimately her job. Seeing the anguish in Percy's expression gave her no pleasure, nor did his sheer agony as the bundle of souls slammed into his own, twisting it into an unrecognizable shape. Watching pain distort his features only solidified Phoebe's opinion that this had been necessary, however. It was clearly much harder for Percy to assimilate a semi-foreign soul that had remained separated from him for decades than a regular clone. Allowing Mickey to survive for centuries or millennia before perishing would have only made things worse. Weird. Why are Mickey's cores still drawing ambient mana, though? She wondered after seeing the crow's mutilated body circulate the violent snowstorm with even greater vigor than when he was alive. Truth be told, she had considered the possibility that the bird's mutation could regrow a missing head, his weird soul and even stranger body having left that door wide open. Had that happened, she would have just forgotten about it, allowing Percy to keep the crow. However, that ship had already sailed. The extended section of Percy's status had vanished, and there wasn't the slightest trace of life left in the frozen carcass. Charging another blast, Deimos gloated about his sick accomplishment. Slowing down the sadistic Violet's perception of time to buy Percy a few more precious seconds, Phoebe ignored Hermes' son entirely, watching with bated breath as the seemingly ownerless cores broke out of the headless sculpture, sinking into the boy's cloak. What the hell is happening to him? Phoebe asked herself in horror, having never seen anything of the sort. Deimos unleashed his attack at last, but she no longer cared about him. She could tell that his pathetic spell wasn't powerful enough to pierce the raging cyclone of ethereal silk and gray mana spinning around Percy. She was far more concerned with the damage that the boy was inflicting on himself than any external threats. Yet, it soon became clear that the chain of surprises had only just begun. Phoebe's eyes widened as she witnessed the unbelievable scene of a Yellow's domain tearing a Violet's to shreds, and the brutal beatdown that ensued. The power that Percy wielded was far higher than anything he and Mickey had been capable of before their unexpected transformation. Thankfully, the boy's situation appeared to have stabilized, though Phoebe could tell that something major had happened. Time after time, she tried to peer into Percy's status, to hopefully shed some light onto his new state, only for her own decree to ignore her. It wasn't until after the fight that it managed to recalibrate itself, finally responding to its creator's will. Even then, the information that manifested before Phoebe's eyes was difficult to accept. Whether Mickey, or even Percy, for that matter, had survived, she still couldn't say with certainty. The name of the new entity didn't match either of theirs. Either way, one thing was immediately clear. Her assessment that the crow had been holding Percy back couldn't have been more wrong. Nobody could have predicted this. Not even Percy and Mickey themselves. But it seemed that they'd started walking on a path to greater heights a long time ago. Perhaps I was the one who made a mistake then, not him, she begrudgingly admitted. More importantly, she couldn't help but linger on a single detail, the very piece of information that she had hoped to see in Percy's status one day. She hadn't expected it to appear nearly this soon, though. An extreme spell. This was the hallmark of a paragon, a mortal capable of slaying gods. Of course, a true paragon needed a clear grade 2, which Percy paradoxically still lacked, even though it was generally considered to be the simplest of the two requirements to meet. Regardless, even Phoebe's ancient heart that had weathered countless seasons without wavering couldn't help but skip a beat as she pondered over the implications of the boy's achievement. Countless thoughts passed through Phoebe's mind in an instant, as even somebody as experienced as her struggled to digest the shocking events she'd just witnessed. Strictly speaking, the strength of the cloaked figure wasn't worth mentioning to a demigod, let alone a Titanus. Even if Percy managed to reach the clear grade himself, the power of a paragon was more of a threat to weaker gods, not those who had mastered several concepts and climbed even further up the cosmic ladder, as she had. That said, that was more of a testament to the boy's lower grade, not an indictment of the spell's quality. Phoebe couldn't help but imagine the ultimate art wielded by a fellow deity one day, the notion giving her goosebumps. I should probably avoid telling him that I was willing to let Mickey die, she decided. Turning her attention back to the collapsing figure, her eyes carefully scanned the information in the lone wanderer's status, taking a moment to absorb the changes. Sometimes, her decree chose the most bizarre names to give to new spells, though it was its first time renaming a person. Phoebe didn't question that too much, since she understood better than anyone how the status worked. It was deeply rooted in the minds of its owners, taking several things into consideration when registering a new entry, from its broad database of similar spells across Remir, to the person's preferences and magical knowledge. The new mutation and upgraded domain didn't surprise her too much either. As impressive as they were just the logical evolutions of abilities that Percy and Mickey had already demonstrated. What she found more concerning was what had happened to the two mortals, though she would likely have to wait until they regained consciousness to learn more. She was about to swoop in to rescue them from the swarming bugs, when she realized that the creatures showed no sign of aggression. I wonder what that's all about. It was no secret that the Starry Queen was as intelligent as a person. More so than most people, in fact, though that didn't explain what the creature wanted from the boy. Phoebe decided to let the scene play out, curious to see what the wasps were going to do. That was when she realized that there was a small problem. Too many layers of dirt, colorful minerals, and dense ambient mana would interfere with her senses, preventing her from observing the mortals. Consequently, she was forced to descend to the surface of the planet, shrouding herself in a veil of mind mana to conceal her presence from everyone's senses as she followed the army of bugs into the hive, ready to intervene if they tried anything funny. Waiting for Percy and Mickey to wake up was pure agony, of course. Even a few centuries were normally nothing to Phoebe, let alone a couple of hours, but not when so much was at stake. Depending on what had happened to the boy, he might become even more important for Remir's future, or this might mark the end of his promising journey. As soon as they regained consciousness, Phoebe watched with bated breath while they explored their new condition inside the crystal-lit chamber. They certainly appeared healthy enough at first glance, causing her to finally exhale in relief. The crow's shape-shifting ability wasn't anything to scoff at either. It looked about as convenient as she'd imagined it would be, turning Mickey, or half of the lone wanderer's existence, at any rate into a creature made almost entirely out of living mana. Sadly, she couldn't peer directly into their mind to know what they were thinking, but she could still infer the gist of what had happened to them. Their souls and minds seemed to have merged completely, she concluded, creasing her brow. This was a good thing for the most part, as it would make them stronger and grant them a wide assortment of new abilities. However, she could see how weird this would feel on a personal level. They'd essentially lost their individuality and muddled their personalities, turning into a jumbled mess of memories. Well, that's not a huge problem. It should be easy enough to fix, assuming that they want it fixed. She shrugged. Phoebe was more than happy to help them separate and segregate their thoughts again later. For a Titanus who had mastered several mind concepts, adding a few mental gates in their head that could be opened or closed at will would be a piece of cake. The fact that they already bore her decree would only make this simpler. With their permission and cooperation, integrating a robust feature into their status to allow them to freely shift between their merged and separated states would only take a couple of days. Not that she was planning to reveal herself to them anytime soon, of course. Acquiring an extreme spell at yellow or green, depending on how she looked at it, was far earlier than she had expected. But they still had plenty of room to grow before she brought them into the fold. For now, they'd have to get used to their merged mind by themselves. Before long, Percy and Mickey were done playing around with their new bodies, causing Phoebe to perk up. It was finally time to see what the Violet Beast had brought them here for. "Seriously?" she asked, clicking her tongue in annoyance as Percy established a spectral connection with the creature, though she should have probably seen this coming. Had their link been forged with mind mana, she might have been able to intrude in their transmission, but soul mana fell squarely outside her expertise. If you spot this tail on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. Regardless, most of her questions got answered as soon as the oversized bug led Percy and Mickey to the next chamber, showing them the inert eggs. Royal eggs? Did something happen to the Queen's successor? Suffice to say, the hive's inner workings were well understood by the Divine Order. They knew about the limitations in the royal line's procreation, and about the jelly they excreted, though Phoebe hadn't realized what a precarious situation the bugs had been in lately. Just who? Frowning, she turned to her daughter, reaching out to her using the mental link that they kept available for convenience. "Athena. Mother?" The fellow goddess responded, clearly startled by the intensity and suddenness in Phoebe's voice. "Did any mortal above Violet step anywhere close to the fungal spire in the last century or so?" Phoebe asked, knowing that her daughter tended to pay more attention to such matters. Athena appeared to ponder the question for a moment before replying. If I'm not mistaken, Machaon, the current leader of House Asclepius, briefly studied alchemy in the guild a few decades ago." "Why? Did anything happen?" After bringing her daughter up to speed, Phoebe worked with her to recall anything suspicious that the White-Cord Man might have done in recent history. Sure enough, it didn't take them long to remember that the cunning mortal had made several strange, if seemingly unrelated, moves in the past few centuries. About 200 years ago, he had caused quite a stir by suddenly deciding to build a grandiose garden for himself in some remote forest, leading many people to wonder whether the unforgiving march of time had eroded the man's sanity. Even the gods had found it a little unusual, though everyone had eventually forgotten about it after seeing that the White's hobby hadn't really affected how he handled his responsibilities as the head of the great house. Going even further back, hadn't Machaon asked the leader of House Etna to let him enroll in their runecrafting academy about 600 years ago? All of that could be, and had been chalked up to the man's eccentricity, an innate curiosity to study various aspects of magic, perhaps, or a desire to fend off the boredom that came with his long life. In hindsight, his intentions appeared a lot more sinister. "That sneaky bastard," Athena cursed. "He's played us for fools all along. Just how long has he been planning this?" The realization sent a chill down Phoebe's spine. As much as she wanted to blame Machaon's greed, she had to acknowledge that this was ultimately her own fault. After all, no mortal would have managed anything of the sort if not for her own negligence. First Percy and now him, she thought. At first glance, the two mortals couldn't differ more. One was a treasure for Remier, the other a silent catastrophe waiting to happen. However, they both served as living proof that she hadn't paid as much attention to the lowborns as she should have. Their grades and shorter lifespans might limit their power and potential, but clearly not their ambitions or their cunning. Left unattended, anyone could apparently alter their world's fate irreversibly. Two of them had done precisely that, coincidentally in the span of a single generation. "Do we know where the garden is?" Phoebe asked, vowing internally to pay more attention to everyone from now on. Athena sent a nod back, prompting Phoebe to continue. "Go. I need you to check up on the Starry Princess. But don't say a word to anyone just yet." It only took her daughter a few minutes to contact her again with some results. "It's just as we feared. The creature is trapped inside a massive enchantment, and it's not looking good. It's still at green. Phoebe swallowed hard. Only 2 advancements in 20 years? That was unheard of for a starry princess. It spoke to how difficult it was, even for the leader of a great house, to keep the bugs sufficiently fed without drawing too much attention. What is he even thinking? The wasp will never live long enough for him to reach the clear grade. Even if McCann managed to incorporate the royal jelly into the Aurora due to further accelerate his advancement, and even if he could keep the bug healthy and well-fed the whole time, its lifespan was far too short. To make matters worse, the princess definitely wasn't healthy at the moment, and the Aurora Dew hadn't even existed while McCann had formulated his insidious plan. Was he planning to have the princess reproduce, continuing to bleed the creatures dry over multiple generations, ignoring both the hive and the rest of the planet as everyone got starved of elixirs? The odds of that working were laughably low. Even if the first wasp made it to Violet, would it be in any condition to reproduce? Granted, the creatures did so asexually, but the process required a lot of energy that the wasp would surely lack. He'd have to repeat the process more than just once or twice too, without any of the royal wasps dying under his watch or failing to reach maturity. McCann wasn't just selfish. He was a complete lunatic. Not only was he going to destroy everything, he was going to do that without any guarantee of success. That bastard was willing to sacrifice all of Remir on a desperate gamble, for merely the slimmest chance of becoming a god. What should I do? Athena asked again, breaking Phoebe out of her thoughts. I can have the wasp back in the hive and McCann's head on a spike in an hour if you want, she snarled, failing to conceal her fury. Wait, Phoebe said as Percy and the previous queen prepared the chamber for their looming operation. It wouldn't be entirely risk-free, but something good could come out of this mess if they played their hand right. For now, keep everything we've learned to yourself. I want you to closely monitor the princess's condition, and to secretly feed her as much food as she needs. I don't care if you have to snatch every green beast that House Hypnos owns. Just make sure the creature gets its fill from now on. Returning the kidnapped beast to its habitat would have been better, but having a goddess personally attend to its every need was the next best thing. By focusing entirely on the creature, and without worrying about anyone's opinion, Athena should be able to stabilize its condition. If Percy failed or the current queen died, they'd have no choice but to bring the princess back immediately. And even if he succeeded but something went wrong with the familiar later, it wouldn't be too late to do so in a couple of decades. Most importantly, Phoebe struggled to contain her curiosity. Seeing what Percy had done for a common crow, she couldn't help but wonder what he might do for one of Remir's most important creatures. A wave of confusion naturally flowed through the connection, as Athena wasn't privy to Phoebe's thoughts. That said, the goddess ultimately chose to keep her doubts to herself, instead asking about something else. What about McCann? Are we just going to let him get away with this? The notion caused a mirthful pang of laughter to escape Phoebe's lips. Get away? After nearly bringing our entire world to ruin? That bastard will get his due one way or the other. I'll see to that personally. She spat, but she wasn't done. Her eyes landed back on Percy, who was getting ready to shove his soul into the egg. Only then did she add, but not right now. Don't let McCann know that we're onto him just yet. He might still be of use to us for a while longer. It wasn't a greater or even a lower spring that the clone had found himself approaching this time. Just a barren world. At least, he hadn't sensed the presence of any gods or powerful mortals, yet he still felt more excited about this trip than he had in a long time. The fact that he'd given himself permission to relax for once, focusing more on the experience itself than the potential benefits, certainly played a huge role, but there was more to it than that. He hadn't even picked a host yet, but the journey through the soul plane had already felt rather fresh for some reason, despite Percy having done this hundreds of times in the past. It wasn't a huge secret where this feeling of novelty was coming from, of course. This was Mickey's first clone. Well, okay. Technically it's the third one, but I still don't have the other's memories back, he corrected himself. After merging with Percy, Mickey remembered all the past clones, but he'd never actually lived through those moments himself, which apparently made quite a difference. Flying through the infinite darkness without the ability to see or hear anything was oddly unsettling for the first time in a while. It also stirred a sense of awe and wonder deep within him, as did the constellation of souls softly shimmering in the distance as soon as he tried to reach out to them. Scanning the sea of potential hosts, he couldn't help but ponder over another fascinating benefit of their recent fusion that he'd discovered soon after he began preparing the latest batch of clones, right before finding himself among their ranks. Evidently, the spike in his mental capabilities had done more than merely allowing the original to coordinate his two bodies. It had also made it several times easier to maintain soul resonance for a prolonged period of time, letting him establish a permanent connection with one of the clones. In the past, that hadn't been an option. Empowering even a single cord used to require a lot of focus, which Percy had rarely been able to spare, given how busy he'd always been with other things. Consequently, he'd only ever done this when he'd had a good reason to. Sadly, by the time the clones realized that they needed help, it was typically too late to reach out to the original. Things were different now. Keeping a single connection open was almost effortless, and even a second instance of soul resonance should be easy to maintain for at least a few days, until the original knew whether it was worth investing more effort into a certain clone, without affecting himself too much. That said, the main body had already widened his connection to one of this clone's older siblings, and pushing himself to keep in touch with all three of them at once didn't exactly fit with the spirit of their vacation. Thus the current clone had been left to embark on this trip by himself. Oh well, it'll only make everything more interesting, he thought with a mental shrug. I should still introduce myself as Mickey to my new host, though, to commemorate the experience. Having made his mind up, Mickey chose a relatively healthy-looking yellow soul, diving into its body. His wisp quickly flowed into the gaps and cracks of his new vessel as he tried to communicate with its owner. Hello? Do you need help with not dying by any chance? Something akin to a pained groan echoed through the person's soul. Their mind was clearly there, though it appeared too foggy for them to form coherent thoughts. Unable to get full consent right away, Mickey found it difficult to strengthen his connection to his host. Left with no other choice, he tapped into the fiends slumbering within his wisp, causing them to wake up. Spectral tendrils shape-shifted into clawed hands, digging into the fragmented soul. Spider-like limbs and long, flailing hairs sprouted along the surfaces of his own wisp, helping him find purchase to pull the fragments together. Obviously, Mickey was much gentler than he'd been while trying to forcefully possess Kassereth. He only wanted to heal his new host, not subjugate him or worsen his injuries. Was it a bit pushy of him to default to his parasitic connection spell? Sure, it was inevitably more painful for his host than a consensual connection, but every second counted when dealing with an injured soul on the verge of death. Mickey would rather violate a couple of personal boundaries than wait for permission. If they don't want to be saved, they can always kill themselves later, he reasoned. Ramming his mind into his hosts, Mickey forced their connection to widen, in an attempt to limit the damage his actions caused. Pulling the shards as close to one another as he could manage without breaking them further, he poured phantom mana from his stash into their surface, slowly knitting the emerging tendrils together into a series of preservation runes. Before long, his host appeared to regain some mental clarity. Mickey felt an odd cocktail of gratitude and annoyance seep through their connection, but the person didn't get the chance to thank or berate him for his reckless assistance. A lot of information flooded Mickey's mind as he finally managed to tap into the body's senses. The cold but familiar embrace of the sea pressing down on his skin from every direction. I can't breathe. Are we underwater again? For a moment there, he thought he was back on Atlantis, though the pressure was negligible by comparison, meaning that they had to be much closer to the surface. The water was warmer than it had been at the bottom of the alien ocean, and his host clearly wasn't meant to survive in this environment. They must have drowned then. We need to swim up. Get out of the cabin before the ship sinks any deeper, a male voice suddenly said, Mickey's new host finally making himself useful. Mickey nodded, trying to follow the man's instructions, when another problem presented itself. The salt water stung their eyes, and the room, or cabin, they were in was clearly too dark for them to see a thing. The fact that there weren't any souls or mana signatures to latch on didn't help. Unable to locate the exit, Mickey swam directly upwards, only to slam face first into a flat, wooden surface. Realizing that the momentary burst of energy that their resurrection had granted them wouldn't last forever, and knowing that he didn't have time to familiarize himself with this body's affinity or other abilities, Mickey resorted to his own means. Reaching into his spatial seal, he pulled out his trusty scythe, turning it incorporeal to ignore the water's resistance as he swung it against what he assumed was the cabin's ceiling. The moment the enchanted blade was about to phase through the wood, he willed it to materialize again, feeling the mundane solid part like paper beneath the weapon's sharpened edge. A single slash wasn't going to get them out, so Mickey repeated his actions with practiced ease, carving out a triangular path through the sinking vessel. Pushing the severed blocks aside was harder than cutting through the wood. Either way, his host's body was at yellow, so Mickey knew that he was strong enough to make it with enough effort. Finally crawling through the hole in the ceiling, he found himself stopped by a second wall, forcing him to keep going. It wasn't until a few seconds later that he finally kicked the last wooden triangle out of his path, escaping from the sinking death trap. Only then did he realize that some parts of the ship weren't fully submerged yet. Grabbing against the deck, he dragged his host out of what would have surely been his watery grave, coughing out one mouthful of salt water after another as he gasped for air, sprawled on a solid if wet floor under the scorching sunlight. "Thanks for saving me," the man whose name Mickey hadn't even bothered to ask said at last. He didn't seem to be in a rush to reclaim control of his body, probably trusting Mickey to do a better job with it. He clearly wasn't above voicing a couple of suggestions, however. "We ain't safe yet. We ain't got long before the ship sinks completely, and these are dangerous waters." Sighing, Mickey rolled over, storing his scythe away as he pushed himself up. While his vacation wasn't supposed to involve any self-motivated pressure to find something useful and rush back to Remier, it didn't mean that his time here was going to be peaceful. Not bothering to examine his current body, he prioritized his surroundings. The ship was among the largest he'd ever seen, making him realize that his host was part of some seafaring civilization. They weren't underwater creatures like Enki's people, just folks that apparently regularly sailed across the ocean. They had fishing boats on Remier too, though they were much smaller and never wandered very far from the coast. There was typically no need, as it was usually easier to reach any place on the continent by land or air. Percy and Mickey hadn't come across any of the fishing villages they knew existed along the shoreline either, as those were rather scarce, and the two of them had only ever entered or exited the ocean through a couple of remote locations. Either way, the oversized ship wasn't in great shape. Mickey was standing on the bow, the floor beneath his feet tilted backwards, facing the stern that sloped the opposite way, with the middle of the vessel submerged between them. If he had to take a guess, the captain must have tried to steer away from some underwater obstacle at the last minute. A reef, perhaps, only to still crash into it sideways, splitting the hull in two. The broken foremast was floating a few dozen meters away from the rest of the ship, though the main mast was clearly still intact, a thick wooden pillar jutting out of the water and hovering just above Mickey's borrowed head. Its sails were torn, loose strips hanging over the figurehead, yellowed strains that seemed to predate the accident dirtying the once beige fabric. The good news is that we're not that far from land, Mickey realized upon spotting an island on the horizon. Coughing out a few lingering dregs of seawater, he wrung the bottom of his shirt as he climbed higher up the sinking boat to buy a few more seconds. The wood was slippery, and not just because it was currently wet. It was covered in rot and moss, the vessel's passengers having clearly not been big on cleaning. Mickey sure didn't appreciate the slimy feeling beneath his feet, especially since it reminded him of his decrepit cell on Hue Hue, but he let that slide, turning his attention back to his host. "When you say dangerous waters?" he asked as his eyes landed on the other sailors desperately trying to swim toward the island. Dangerous or not, swimming to shore was obviously the only way for any of them to survive, and the other men clearly had a head start on Mickey's host, who must have been asleep when the ship crashed. "Very dangerous," the man replied, swallowing hard. "The sea is teemin' with yellow and green beasts. To be honest with ya, drownin' might ave been a mercy. I'd pick that over gettin' eaten alive." Mickey scoffed, thinking that the guy was just being difficult. "At least there's a chance to survive now," he protested. With your grade, swimming to shore won't take us too long. Maybe there aren't any predators, Nerb. He didn't even get to the end of that sentence, when one of his host's crewmates suddenly got dragged underwater, without even getting the chance to let out a scream. The sea bubbled and foamed around him for the briefest of instants, causing the other sailors to swim even faster in their panic as the spot around their unfortunate comrade turned crimson. Well, shit. Mickey watched the sailors swim toward the island with all their strength. The poor souls didn't even dare to toss a glance back as their crewmates got dragged to the dark depths one after the other. Some tried to resist the monsters. Colors of every common affinity flashed beneath the surface as the distraught men fired their spells at their hunters. Mickey guessed that a couple of blasts might have even landed, though he failed to spot any carcasses. The dead creatures were probably devoured by their kin almost immediately. The water foamed and roiled as pools of blood blossomed like flowers all over the aquatic battlefield, the thick scent of iron mixing with the salty breeze. It was strangely quiet, however, as nobody dared to so much as let a whisper out, probably afraid to attract the beast's attention. The sailors were at too much of a disadvantage against the monsters. There were too many beasts and they were fighting in their element. If there was one thing that worked in the Sapiens' favor, it was the fact that each of their dead companions bought the survivors a couple of extra seconds. Mickey had counted over 100 men originally, though their numbers had already been cut down to the low dozens by the time they approached land, and they weren't even there yet. Meanwhile, Mickey and his host were still stuck watching the horror show atop the sinking ship. Damn it, we've fallen too far behind. Swimming by ourselves would be suicide at this point, Mickey said. Not only did they have nobody to split the monster's focus with, the commotion must have drawn even more creatures to the area. Getting through the blockade without help wouldn't be easy. Then again, they couldn't afford to stay on the shipwreck much longer. Looking back, Mickey realized that the vessel had sunk a couple of meters deeper, the surface of the water having already swallowed the hole they just climbed through. Swiftly running out of options, he pulled up his status, skimming through the information quickly in search of anything he could work with. Undersir.
Marnoc du Vent Noir, the lone Wandreas clone.
Mana cores. Mana core 1, yellow or air. Mana core 2, seed. Domain. Pulse, dormant. Spectral traits. Weaving. Boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Insomnia. Eliminates the need for sleep. Ascribing. Boosts one's proclivity in expressing meaning onto any written medium. Spells. Spectral art. Parasitic connection, refined. Spectral art. Cauldron of 1,000 whispers. Masterful. Spectral art. Instantaneous formation, masterful. Alchemic principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. Pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. Deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana.
Restructuring. Alter an ingredient, S-phase.
Scaling. Brew a greater volume of ingredients at once. Compression. Elevate an ingredient to the next grade. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Morai's decree, incomplete, grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's decree, open a one-way portal to the vault of magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Obatala's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Allows you to effortlessly deploy your domain in its strongest state. Undersir. This wasn't the time to memorize his host's full name, nor to dwell on the fact that Marnoc was apparently considered the lone wanderer's clone. Focusing on the details that mattered, Mickey realized, to his great dismay, that the man didn't have much going for him. An air affinity. Not the best, but at least it's one I'm skilled with. Sadly, even if he poured enough life mana into the sailor's second core, he wouldn't be able to clear enough channels to fully activate it in the next few minutes. Preparing his body for circulation would be even harder, and the domain was back to being dormant again, an inevitable consequence of changing bodies. Awakening it with a single yellow core would be extremely difficult, and the weak pulses wouldn't help that much even if he somehow succeeded. Even worse, he'd already consumed some of his stashed phantom mana to stitch up Marnock's injuries. Mickey still had plenty left, but its best use would be to fuel the Harvester's enchantments, allowing him to wield the deadly weapon for as long as possible. The sharpened scythe could be used to slaughter dozens of yellow beasts and even a bunch of greens with ease, assuming that the creatures took turns attacking them. Sadly, the hungry monsters were far more likely to swarm them from every direction. Mickey didn't have enough mana to replicate the scythe, and there was only so much that he'd be able to do with a single weapon. Any brilliant ideas? Marnock pressed, his heart beating wildly. The poor guy was clearly frightened, and Mickey couldn't exactly blame him. Getting eaten alive was a terrible way to go, and, unlike him, the yellow didn't have another body to return to. Scanning the area in front of him carefully, Mickey measured the distance to shore, estimating roughly how long their reserves would last if they used them sparingly. About 3 kilometers to go. Using air mana to attack the beasts would be a waste. We're better off propelling ourselves forward whenever they're about to catch us. But it still won't be enough to get us even halfway there. If he used a couple more tricks, they might make it a bit farther, though whether it would be enough remained to be seen. Either way, the water had almost reached the ship's figurehead where Marnock was standing, indicating that they were almost out of time. The resurrected sailor was about to speak again, when Mickey made a move. Drawing some air mana to his hand, he played with it for a second or two, trying to fashion it into a rune to test an idea. The concept behind it was similar to his instantaneous imprint spell, though air mana was much harder to force into a fixed shape than metal mana, and Mickey didn't have Kasritha's blue core right now, nor a domain to help him. Come on, just stay put already. He spat through gritted teeth, stirring the scribing traits slumbering inside his soul. Almost immediately, the green motes snapped into place, forming a small, circular symbol in Marnock's palm. It was a concealment rune, blocking everything behind it from Mickey's mana sense. Sadly, the rune didn't last long, the unruly resource simply refusing to remain still. The very next second, the shape fell apart, robbing the enchantment of its effect. Sighing, Mickey realized that this wasn't going to work. He'd wanted to try and mask his host's core to reduce the number of attacking monsters. He wouldn't be able to hide from the rest of their senses, but if he could just lessen the pressure slightly, he'd have an easier time killing the rest or escaping. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. Even if he managed to keep the rune from crumbling for a prolonged period of time, and while swimming, he'd need multiple enchantments to conceal their core from every direction. Damn it, he swore. I should start equipping my clones with concealment bandages. Then again, hindsight was 20/20. The reality was that his spatial seals had a limited capacity, and he couldn't possibly carry every single tool that he might need in his adventures. Suddenly, a tall wave rose a little higher than the rest of the sea, licking Marnock's heels. Under other circumstances, the water's cold touch would have felt refreshing, a welcome break from the burning sunlight drying the sweat on their forehead, caking their scalp in a salty crown. Right now, it only served as a grim reminder that their time was up. Gathering all the strength that he could muster, Mickey leapt off the tip of the figurehead, trying to cover as much distance as he could before splashing into the ocean. By the time he found himself submerged, he had summoned his scythe again and hurled it downwards. The spectral weapon phased soundlessly through the water, flying in a wide circle beneath his host's body, spinning and invisible. Mickey might not be able to hide his host's core under these circumstances, but at least the greedy beasts wouldn't be able to sense the deadly construct. Swim as fast as you can, he said, giving Marnock control of his body back. He figured that his host would be able to handle his limbs better than him anyway. At the same time, Mickey allowed his senses to unfold outwards, locking onto several mana signatures closing in rapidly. He couldn't make their shapes out, but their grades were obvious enough. Over 30 orange creatures and a dozen yellows were about to reach them. No greens had appeared yet, but this was still a lot of beasts to fend off at once. The weapon worked overtime, flying rapidly through the cold abyss, splitting a creature's soul in half with each violent revolution. The poor fuckers never stood a chance. This was a weapon that had claimed the lives of multiple blues and even a violet, after all. Still, more beasts took notice of the swimming sailor soon enough. At least, Mickey had made sure not to inflict any physical wounds on his victims, unwilling to spill even more blood into the water. Even so, he doubted that it would take long for the surviving monsters to realize what a sumptuous feast he had laid before them. Marnock's limbs burned from the effort as he swam as fast as he could, the water failing to cool his muscles down. Mickey, too, poured everything he had into his weapon, slaughtering the aquatic horrors by the dozens as their numbers kept increasing. The first greens arrived, the scythe still managing to carve through their souls like a hot knife through butter. However, Mickey knew that this wasn't without cost. The more he used the construct, the more it would degrade, forcing him to sacrifice some of his phantom mana to fuel the self-repairs. This wasn't a problem back on Remier, as he could always rely on an endless supply of ambient mana thanks to the dance. Here, every single drop was priceless. Sure enough, the weapon began to slow down about a minute later, indicating that its edge had dulled. Gritting his borrowed teeth, Mickey extracted a hefty chunk of phantom mana from his stash, letting the scythe fly through the gray blob to repair itself. The school of monstrous fish seized the opportunity to draw closer, faster than he could kill them. Mickey was forced to consume some air mana too, the momentary burst propelling him several meters ahead, just enough to break out of the encirclement. He wasn't in the mood to celebrate, however, fully aware that both of his mana pools had shrunk noticeably in the past few minutes, and they'd covered less than half of the distance to their destination. A similar situation played out a few seconds later. The other sailors must have reached the island already, or perished entirely. Mickey didn't know which. Either way, they had freed up more of the monsters, putting pressure on Marnock. The sailor tried to refill his core with every strained breath, though he was clearly approaching his limits. Noticing this, Mickey emptied a few healing potions in the man's stomach to relieve his fatigue. The life mana barely lingered for a fraction of a second in the yellow's muscles before the seed in his abdomen gobbled it up. More beasts attacked, and more died, as Mickey and Marnock used everything at their disposal to survive for as long as possible. They drained their reserves at a scary rate, their expenditure vastly exceeding their pitiful intake as the situation grew more dire by the second. Even so, they persisted, covering about 2/3 of the journey by the time Mickey's phantom mana ran out completely. Marnock's air mana lasted a little longer because he'd kept trying to replenish it, though he eventually emptied his core too. Another 500 meters later. Losing the ability to repair the scythe, Mickey watched it dull again, giving the monsters a chance to draw nearer once more. Left with no other choice, he discarded the scythe's shaft entirely, breaking the blade into 3 fragments, and using them to kill the creatures thrice as fast. It worked for a while, buying him and his host a few more precious breaths, though the pieces only degraded faster when wielded separately like this. Thankfully, they'd already drawn close enough to the island that the sea had grown shallower. Mickey estimated that the seabed was only 4 or 5 meters below the swimming sailor, greatly limiting the number and sizes of creatures that could encircle them at once. By the time Mickey felt the sweet feeling of sand beneath his feet, what remained of his weapon was entirely useless, and his host was making wheezing noises with every exhausted heave. The creatures chasing them hadn't given up yet, however. Some kind of giant crocodile lunged at the tired sailor, its colossal maw about to snap shut around his body, its curved fangs glinting beneath the bright sunlight. The monster's enormous head disappeared, falling inside a circular portal, metallic surfaces covered in pulsing runes visible on the other side. Mickey promptly deactivated the decree, giving the green creature the Cyrnith treatment, and the rest of the monsters a nice little distraction. The smaller beasts were more than happy to fight each other over the bloody feast, devouring the elephant-sized reptile in seconds as they dug through its flesh in search for its nutritious core. By the time they were done, Marnock had already walked out of the water. Even so, the man clearly didn't dare to stop moving until he was over 30 meters from the edge of the sea. Only then did he allow himself to plop down weakly, hugging the scorching sand as if it was his long-lost lover. Mickey shared the sentiment, though his attention was inevitably drawn to the other survivors slowly surrounding him and his host, their mouths agape. The sound of the tall waves washing over the coast was strangely soothing, almost like the sea had forgotten the horrific massacre that had taken place in its depths just then. The sailors didn't seem to care about the ocean's cruel irony in the slightest, too busy whispering to one another while gawking at Mickey's host. "Marnock, how in the reefs did you pull that off?" one of the survivors barked, holding out a hand to haul him up. Mickey found it odd that he could register the sailors' weird speech patterns, having never experienced anything of the sort in the past. His hosts all spoke languages entirely alien to him, which he could only understand thanks to their connection. Any weird quirks that they exhibited tended to get absorbed by the translation entirely, sounding like regular sentences in his mind. The fact that he could notice the discrepancy probably meant that Marnock had been exposed to the correct version of his language, yet both him and his crewmates clearly insisted on butchering it by clinging to their uncouth sailor speak like a bunch of barbarians. Oh well, I suppose I can forgive them for being a little difficult to understand, considering all the shit they've been through today. Oblivious to his thoughts, Marnock groaned, clearly wishing that the others would let him rest on the soft sand a few seconds longer. He ultimately kept those thoughts to himself, however, and to the nosy foreigner sharing his body, of course, before grabbing his friend's hand. The man helping him up released a burst of mana from his palm, sending it into Marnock's body. Mickey was a little surprised by the familiar rush of life mana, having not expected to meet someone with a rare affinity here. That said, the sailor's generous attempt to heal his friend didn't amount to much, the mana getting sucked into the seed in Marnock's abdomen the very next instant. Much like the potions from earlier. I hope he didn't realize what happened, Mickey thought, though he mentally shook his head the very next second. Didn't really matter, did it? This wasn't a developed world, and the sailors were all at yellow or orange, stranded on an island with questionable odds of making it out alive. Besides, even if he told them everything about the Morais decree or his bloodline, there was a good chance that they wouldn't believe him. That was why he didn't bother coaching his host, letting him make up whatever excuse he wanted. Marnock opted to go for the good old strategy of playing dumb, pretending that he'd escaped from the aquatic horrors through sheer luck. Well, that wasn't entirely false, though Mickey's host conveniently left out a few crucial details, such as the hundreds of powerful creatures that the parasitic ghost hiding in his body had slaughtered using his now-broken scythe, or the portal to a different world that said Spectre had employed to rip a green reptile apart. Tuning the pointless part of the conversation out, Mickey focused on something more interesting. He scanned the sailors up and down, finally getting a chance to learn more about them and this place. They look surprisingly similar to humans, he noted. He might have even struggled to tell them apart, if not for the overly square jaws barely concealed beneath their bushy beards, or the way the top of their ears pointed outwards. Their bodies were admittedly a little too muscular to pass as humans, however, their skins sporting a deep bronze color. Then again, those features could have just as well been caused by their rough lives sailing across the ocean. Their attire varied slightly from person to person, though it was generally centered around a certain theme. Most wore loose, cropped trousers that Mickey guessed had been fashioned out of repurposed sailcloth. They were paired with V-collared or buttoned linen shirts, their sleeves rolled up to their elbows. Many had a thick sash tied around their waists. Marnock's was red, though Mickey saw some green, yellow, orange, and blue ones. A few of the more uncommon features included piercings that a couple of sailors wore on one or both ears, and a crimson bandana that one of them had wrapped around his forehead. Marnock was in the minority that didn't have boots on. Only 3 out of 15 had made it to shore barefoot like him, and only 2 had orange cores, the rest being at yellow. Unauthorized tail usage. If you spot this story on Amazon, report the violation. I suppose the survivors are heavily skewed toward the higher grades who had been awake when the ship crashed, he reasoned. One unlucky sailor had reached the island buck naked, making Mickey thank his lucky stars that Marnock had slept with clothes on. Spending the whole trip in his host's birthday suit would have been way too embarrassing. Still better than getting killed within the first hour, though, he reminded himself, thinking back to the unfortunate swimmers. Mickey wasn't sure how many had died in total. He'd personally witnessed close to 100 getting eaten alive, though many more had likely drowned inside the sinking vessel before he'd even arrived here. Alas, there was nothing he could do about those poor souls, other than maybe praying that their final moments had been swift and not too painful. Turning his attention back to the sailors' conversation, he perked up upon realizing that they'd already moved past the topic of Marnock's unexpected survival and onto other, more important things. "What are we even going to do now?" a man asked, his voice cracking with worry. "We ain't got a scrap of food nor a drop of ale left. I'd be more worried about endin' up as food ourselves," another growled. "Edric, you sure those things won't chase us here?" "The ones in the ocean won't," a sailor, Edric presumably, said. "They're smarter than you give 'em credit for. Wouldn't risk fightin' so many of us on land. Most can't even survive outside the waves. But I won't rule out some green beast crawlin' out of the jungle," he added, gesturing toward the dense foliage some distance away from where the group was standing. "Great. So how are we supposed to survive?" the first man muttered again. "Edric's got a water affinity. He can conjure drinks for us. You don't need ale to survive. I say, 'tis best we take a breather before doing anything reckless," the life affinity user said. On closer inspection, Mickey realized that he knew the man's name. His host had to be familiar with all of his crewmates, not just the healer, but Mickey had known for a while that people his hosts interacted more often with tended to leave a deeper impression in their minds, allowing him to access some of that information himself. This was largely how he'd managed to get by during his brief stay in the Proudheart Academy on Felmara, and also how he could understand and speak his hosts' languages while sharing their body. Either way, Flammy's most distinguishing features were 2 golden teeth in the upper right side of his mouth, along with a vertical scar over his left eye. The man had clearly used his life affinity to seal his wound a long time ago, though he didn't seem skilled enough to get rid of the lingering traces that his injury had left behind. Oblivious to Mickey's thoughts, the other sailors nodded in agreement with the healer, many of them plopping down on the spot. "How the bloody depths did Ol Harash even manage to sink the ship?" the naked man asked, drawing everyone's attention. "Captain was a stubborn bastard, all right, but he sure knew his stuff when it came to sailin'. Never seen him screw everything up this badly. The old sod downed a barrel o' rum last night, that's how," one of the Orange Corps snarled, spitting on the sand. "Told him it was a bad idea too, but he wouldn't listen. Always knew the ol sack of bones would drink himself to death on day," another swore. "Never thought he'd nearly take the lot of us down with him, though." "Well, that's just perfect, ain't it?" the sailor with the red bandana said. "This was supposed to be an easy voyage, 4 months air and back, safe as houses in the Commodore's waters. Not a soul from the Broom's Indigo fleet to trouble us. Not to mention nearly 200 men to storm this place. And now look at us. Can't even protect ourselves. Are we still chasing that treasure?" Mickey couldn't help but raise one of his host's eyebrows upon hearing the word treasure. Sure, he probably shouldn't expect much from a barren world like this, but he still struggled to suppress his curiosity. "What choice do we have?" another sailor asked. "We have to trek into the jungle if we don't want to starve, so might as well head for the tomb. If it's truly where our intel says, we might find something buried with the ol saint that can help us." Soft murmurs rippled through the group, most of the men nodding in agreement. A few didn't seem to like the idea much, but everyone understood that they couldn't just stay on the beach waiting for their deaths. Meanwhile, Mickey couldn't help but shift his attention to his host. "Hey, who's this saint whose tomb you guys are after? Someone important, I take it." Mickey tried to temper his expectations, knowing that, at the end of the day, he'd only come here to have some fun. Obviously, he wouldn't shy away from helping someone in need, which was why he'd done his best to save Marnock earlier, but he didn't think that he'd be walking away with anything particularly valuable. At most, he was hoping to spend some time practicing a certain trick that he hadn't had a chance to work on with his main body in the past few years. One that would factor heavily into his future plans. That said, His host's next couple of sentences flipped those expectations on their head, making Mickey realize that there might be more to this world than he'd initially thought. Of course, he's someone important. Saint Ludwig was one of Robari's last demigods. Mickey had several questions, not the least of which being, how did a barren world without elixirs ever produce demigods? He wasn't in a rush to voice them, however. First, he and his host had to take a few precautions to raise their odds of surviving the upcoming trek. After giving Marnock a brief explanation about himself and the second core, Mickey began emptying ridiculous amounts of healing potions and mushrooms into their stomach, allowing the gluttonous vortex in their abdomen to absorb the mana. Man, repairing the decree has never been easier, he thought. In the past, his clones had mostly relied on unprocessed mushrooms rather than finished potions. The problem with the former was that they contained more than just raw life mana, which meant that they left traces behind after getting drained. Mickey couldn't just dump 100,000 mushrooms inside a person's stomach at once and expect them to digest the fungi in a reasonable time frame. The best alternative would be to summon a pile outside the body, draining them a few at a time. That came with its own issues, however, namely the fact that the other sailors would inevitably question where the mountain of mushrooms had come from. Thankfully, things had recently changed a little. Mickey's main bodies were currently brewing hundreds of doses of healing potion per hour back on Remier, leisurely honing their alchemic skills. Thanks to his larger cauldron, improved yield and the endless supply of dead wasps that the Starry Queen was more than happy to give him, he could convert enormous volumes of fungi into potions in a relatively short amount of time. It wasn't like he had a better use for them either. Repairing a person's second core through potions alone would still amount to a couple of weeks of non-stop brewing. So Mickey was hesitant to rely solely on them, which was why he was using a mixture of mushrooms and potions. The moment the fungi got drained, he stored the empty husks back into his seal, to hide them from the others and make room in Marnock's stomach for more. Even better, he had more space than ever before, since his main bodies were down to just 3 cords. That meant that he would only ever need a maximum of 4 spatial seals, so he'd never have to divide the artifact more than twice. By skipping the bottom denomination entirely, he could ensure that every clone had 8 times the capacity. In hindsight, maybe I should start equipping the clones with more stuff than just food, mushrooms, potions, and a scythe, he thought, challenging his earlier assumption. Alas, that was more of a suggestion to his future self. It wouldn't help him much right now. A few minutes later, the second core was finally done accepting mana. Mickey instructed his host to start clearing channels for it. The sooner they got it into working condition, the sooner it would start helping them. If there was one thing that Mickey loved about Barren Worlds, it was the fact that his hosts had never advanced before meeting him, making their second cores just as powerful as their first ones, giving him the most value for his efforts. Mickey didn't slack while his host was busy with the new organ, focusing on a different task. He turned his attention to their first core, resuming the project that he had failed to complete atop the ship. This time, he didn't bother drawing any air mana to his hands, trying to shape it into a concealment rune while still inside his host's sternum. Maintaining the enchantment like this would inevitably be much harder, but they would only need a single, much smaller rune to mask their mana signature, and they wouldn't have to worry about the ocean's currents, or anything else in their environment, disturbing the enchantment. Come on! Just stay still for a second, he groaned internally, though he struggled to force the unruly resource into shape even with the scribing trait's help. The idea of drawing the rune inside his core hadn't come out of thin air. Mickey, or rather Percy, had envisioned the potential of combining precasting with Magiscript since he first learned about it on Felmara. Of course, he'd always known that it would be extremely difficult. In fact, he doubted that even the most skilled Felmarans had ever succeeded. Then again, Mickey had several unique advantages that Leo's people had lacked, giving him hope. Even so, this was a project that he had put aside for the longest time, until he met the prerequisites to properly attempt it. Over the years, he had grown increasingly proficient with both arts, and his scribing trait was the final nail in the coffin that should allow him to embark on this difficult journey. It's going to be a while before I'm any good at it, but I need to give it a shot if I ever want to turn my boosting art into a permanent promotion. At the very least, Mickey didn't see any way of upgrading his spell that didn't involve drawing lots of runes inside his body. Whether he could make enough progress with this ambitious project in time to benefit Marnock remained to be seen, but they would certainly get attacked by several more beasts in the coming days, so having a way to hide their presence wouldn't hurt. This book's true home is on another platform. Check it out there for the real experience. As the two men worked hard on their respective tasks, Mickey spared some attention to resume their previous conversation, still curious about this world. So, Marnock, you said that this place was called Rabari? Is that the name of your country or the whole planet? Also, would you mind explaining what you meant by demigods earlier? I didn't spot any souls above yellow while looking for a body. The sailor shrugged before replying. Rabari is our world. We used to Ave not just demigods but even full-fledged gods too, a long, long time ago. Of course, none of us folks alive today was around to see that, but the evidence is pretty darn clear. Mickey couldn't help but frown. So, this place was actually a former Lesser Spring. In many ways, that sounded like an even crueler fate than being born on a barren world without any knowledge of the wider cosmos or the possibilities that lay beyond the bottom grades. After all, it always hurt more to lose something precious than to have never possessed it. What caused this? He asked. Nobody knows exactly, Marnock replied with a sigh. The details were lost to time, but our gods were killing one another for some reason. A bunch of them fell as others escaped Rabari with their tails tucked between their legs. The worst was that they ruined our only source of beast mana, leaving us stuck at our birth grades. Though it ain't all gloom and doom. How so? Mickey asked, struggling to see a silver lining. Well, there is some beast mana left. Rather than letting it hang out in the open for Nyon to grab, our saints decided to brew it into a solid shape to make it last longer. They buried piles upon piles of priceless coins with fool's amber we call, hiding it for future greenborns to find. Mickey let out a soft whistle, thinking that the demigods' plan was rather smart. After failing to attain divinity themselves, they chose to do everything they could to raise Rabari's odds of producing new gods later. Had they not hidden the coins, the Yellowborns and Orangeborns would have split them among themselves, maybe advancing once or twice and living a couple of centuries longer, at the cost of wasting their world's last traces of beast mana. By gathering the coins up and stashing them away in hidden locations, they made it more likely for the Holy Children to find and collect enough of them to reach the clear grade. How can they ensure that a Greenborn finds the buried treasure and not anybody else, though? Mickey asked. Assuming that the coins were as effective as Remir's elixirs, even the Greenborns would need several thousand years' worth to advance 4 times, and there had to be lots of Yellowborns around hunting for the lost treasure. Well, there ain't New York way to be sure. But they probably knew that the new Greenborns would hold all the power after the higher grades died out. They'd also live longer than Nyon else, thus having more time to amass enough amber and expand their advantage. And that's exactly what ended up happening. So, your world is currently ruled by a bunch of powerful Greenborns? Pretty much. Only 4 of them are currently at white, split in the seas among themselves. Each lets a couple subordinates reach blue, but not violet. It would cost too much amber and threaten their rule. The 4 navies are constantly fighting over the few tombs that haven't been found yet, racing toward the clear grade. I see, Mickey muttered. He didn't recall spotting any whites or blues while scanning the planet. Hell, he hadn't seen any greens either, even though he knew there had to have been some Greenborns around. Unlike gods, powerful mortal souls didn't stand out as much, so it was easier to miss a bunch of them scattered in a population of hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Do you think any of them will make it? He asked. Hard to say. 2 are supposedly close, including our own Commodore Ventnoir. Of course, there have been other whites in the past, but none of them made it to the end. Not even when the Fool's Amber was more abundant than it is now. Mickey nodded internally. What his host had left unsaid was that even if one of the whites somehow made it to the clear grade, there wasn't any guarantee that they'd be able to attain divinity. Only a tiny fraction of demigods ever did, so this world was probably screwed regardless. But he didn't see any point in talking about that. Instead, he homed into something else that Marnock had mentioned.
Commodore Vent Noir?
Isn't that the same surname as you? Are you two related by any chance? Marnock guffawed, garnering weird looks from the other sailors sitting nearby. He didn't seem very bothered by it, merely waving their curious gazes away apologetically before responding. Don't I wish? You think I'd be puttin' me hide on the line for some All Saints treasure if I'd been the boss's nephew? 'Tis just how we do things on Rabari. We all carry the name of one of the 4 fleets, to signal who owns us. Why does he send you to collect the amber in his stead? Isn't he worried that you'll keep it to yourselves? Mickey asked, finding that difficult to believe. A yellowborn like Marnock was never going to make it very far, but even reaching green would make a huge difference in his life. They trust that most people ain't dumb enough to double-cross him. Where would we even hide if we stole from Commodores? All the oceans belong to anyway. We wouldn't even get a chance to use coins before they found us. Is Rabari all ocean and islands? No large landmass? Mickey asked. Pretty much. Well, the islands the Commodores live on are bigger than the rest, but not by much. Anyway, the Saints did a good job hiding their burial places, so we're still finned in more to this day. But it's slowing down. I doubt there's many left. Mickey nodded once more, satisfied with his host's explanation. Part of him was starting to get a little excited about the Saint's tomb. He didn't personally need any fool's amber, of course, since he doubted that it was any better than the nectar he now had a near infinite amount of. But he had no idea what else the demigod might have buried with him. Even if there's nothing, I can still make some progress with precasting, so the trip won't be a complete waste, he reminded himself. Everyone felt a lot less tired by sunset, though the sailors agreed that it was best to wait until morning before beginning their journey into the island's unwelcoming depths. Granted, time was precious, and it wasn't like they were completely safe on the beach, but delving into the jungle at night would have been even riskier. A small campfire burned amidst the sleeping men, giving the fine sand a rich golden hue. Many had argued against lighting the flame up, of course. The hardened seafarers didn't really need it for warmth, nor did they have any food to roast over it, so nearly half of the group had insisted not to risk attracting any nearby beasts. The rest had convinced them that it would be better not to fight the monsters in complete darkness, should any choose to attack anyway. Marnock was among the few men still awake. Heeding Mickey's advice, he'd volunteered to join the small team on guard duty. It was the best way to take advantage of their insomnia trait without revealing its existence to anyone else, allowing them to continue working on their projects. They'd have to pretend to sleep tomorrow, of course, but that was neither here nor there. Mickey had also told his host not to activate the new core immediately, as it could draw unnecessary attention from friend and foe alike. Either way, Marnock was still about a day away before he was done clearing enough channels for it. Mickey wasn't much closer to forming a stable rune inside their first core either. Eatin' that crap will give you the runs, the sailor with the red bandana told another, drawing Marnock and Mickey's attention. The man had kept his voice low so as to not wake up everyone, but his words couldn't escape a yellow's ears from only a few meters away if they weren't sleeping already. The second person was munching on a pile of seaweed that the waves had washed up. Mickey found the notion of eating the slimy leaves disgusting. Not to mention that he personally wouldn't have dared to step any closer to the dark waters, afraid of the abominations that might still be lurking in their depths. The fact that the rising tide had brought the sea closer to the group over the past couple of hours certainly didn't help with his paranoia. Marnock's crewmate didn't seem to care about the danger in the slightest, nor did he appear to mind the texture of his meal. Better this than starvin'. Unless New York of ya is hidin' more of 'em crackers. 'Tis all I'm goin' to get tonight. The sailor was referring to a funny scene that had unfolded on the beach earlier. One of the others had secretly tried to eat a small pouch of food that he'd managed to bring out of the sinking ship. The seawater had turned the crackers soggy, though that hadn't stopped him nor had it deterred the naked guy from wrestling him for the food. In the end, they'd split the meal, but only after providing some much-needed entertainment to their crewmates. Marnock chuckled, as did the man with the bandana, though nobody said anything else. Mickey wasn't as worried about the food as the rest of the group, carrying some rations in his spatial seal. He didn't have too many, They would barely last Marnock a week or two, so sharing them with anybody was out of the question. Either way, Mickey's host was going to outlast his crewmates if they failed to find anything else. Then again, that wasn't a good outcome either. Marnock would find it exceedingly difficult to survive on the island by himself, relying on nothing but a pair of yellow cores. Fingers crossed for a good affinity, Mickey thought. A rare or composite mana type would be best, especially if it was one that he was familiar with. He'd even settle for water to fuse with air into ice, or anything solid that he could more easily draw runes with. Of course, the Morais decree had never much cared about his wishes, so he was under no delusion that it would start listening now. At the end of the day, they'd have to make do with whatever they got. He was about to resume working on his project, when somebody sat next to his host. It was Flammy, the life user that had tried to heal them as soon as they reached the island, and who Mickey guessed was Marnock's close friend. As if to confirm Mickey's assumption, his host leaned closer to the healer, whispering in his ear, "Thanks for the treatment earlier. Did you know this text is from a different site? Read the official version to support the creator." Flammy grinned, his golden teeth glinting as they reflected the playful flames of the campfire. "Don't sweat it, mate. I'm a wee bit surprised you noticed, though. Felt like me mana vanished the moment it entered your body. Wasn't sure it did anything." "Nah, I definitely feel better now," Marnock replied vaguely, not bothering to explain the decree's shenanigans to his friend. "I ave to admit, I didn't expect to see you alive and well on the beach. Thought the fish would ave eaten your face off. Given your affinity and everything. Got worried about me, did ya?" Flammy asked, his grin widening. "Worried? Nah, would ave been an improvement," Marnock replied, cracking a smile of his own. Both men burst into laughter, before Flammy moved to a more serious topic. "Say, did you buy that crap about the captain getting drunk?" Marnock shrugged. "He was always drunk. That much I ain't doubtin'. Not so sure about him getting the ship wrecked, though. Al-Harash knew, is shit better than Nyon I know. He could ave stirred that boat into a storm while sleepin', and I'd ave bet on him making it to the other side in one piece." Flammy sighed. "So, you also thinkin' something's fishy?" Marnock shrugged. "'Tis Rabari, mate. There's always something fishy goin' on." Flammy nodded, patting Marnock's shoulder. He was about to stand when Mickey's host grabbed him. "What's your plan, Flammy? You still interested in the treasure? What choice does New York of us ave? Commodore's going to skin us alive if we fail. Besides, me family in Ravisport's gotta eat. Why? You thinkin' of Balan?" "Balan, no," Marnock said, shaking his head. "Where would I even go? We're all stuck air, till they send 'nother boat lookin' for us. Just thinkin' we should be focusing on survivin' rather than treasure. We can worry about the amber later." "You heard the others, Marnock. Two's the same thing now. Can't get food without going in the jungle. And, if we go in the jungle Niue, might as well head to the tomb." Marnock nodded, begrudgingly letting go of his friend. "Are you all in this to feed your families?" Mickey asked once his host was alone again. "Most of 'em are," Marnock said. "Not you. Ain't got a family no more. Not since the Lisclair fleet raided Narasport and butchered me wife and kids. Now, I'm just hopin' to help Commodore Ventnoir get strong enough to kill that Lisclair fucker. Still, I ain't desperate enough to throw me life aside on a random island for no reason neither." Mickey nodded internally. He hadn't realized how intense his host was. Evidently, offering him a ticket to the vault to save his ass was probably off the table. Not that Mickey wanted to spend his vacation dealing with Metatron. He'd have to go back to the artificial world sooner or later, but he wasn't quite ready to clean up the mess he'd left there the previous time. Besides, he'd rather make some progress with his current project first, to get a better idea of what books he'd need to buy from the cube for the next step. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though Mickey doubted that they'd keep getting this lucky. Once the sun was up, and all the sailors with it, the group started walking along the coast, circling the island. This was arguably going to take longer than heading to their destination directly, but they wanted to travel the shortest possible distance through the jungle, as that was easily going to be the most dangerous part of the journey. Nobody spoke much, all the seafarers probably trying to preserve as much of their strength as they could. That suited Mickey and his host just fine. It was mostly quiet, save for the sailors' muted footsteps on the sand, or the soothing sound of the waves washing against the coast, allowing Mickey and Marnock to focus on their tasks. Mickey managed to whip the concealment rune into shape multiple times, though the enchantment never survived more than a second or two, leading him to believe that he would have to come up with some other trick to get this to work. As for Marnock, he'd already cleared over 2/3 of his new channels, bringing him that much closer to discovering his second affinity. The relative quiet served them better as a group too, since it allowed them to keep their ears open to any potential threats. It also helped Mickey notice something else, however, something that he found more than a little odd. 3 of the sailors were coughing. Not much. It was just a light cough every minute or two. Thinking back, Mickey realized that 2 of them had started since the night before, though nobody seemed to have paid much attention to it. Mickey probably wouldn't have noticed it either under normal circumstances. After all, it had only been the Orangeborns at first. Their bodies weren't that much stronger than a Red's, and they had just swum out of a shipwreck earlier that day. The water hadn't been very warm either, so it was entirely conceivable that they'd caught a cold. But why has the Yellowborn joined them? Mickey wondered. It was the same person who had eaten the seaweed while on guard duty, which again, Mickey would have chalked up to food poisoning had it happened in isolation. Still, he didn't think this was a coincidence. Better keep my eyes open, he decided. He couldn't put his finger on it just yet, but he couldn't shake a strange sense of unease from creeping through. Something about this place was off. Lacking enough information to determine with any certainty what exactly was making the sailors ill, Mickey decided to let the situation unfold, and to deal with everything as it came. Ignoring the coughing men, he took a moment to bask in the warm sunlight, and to take a few deep breaths of the cool, salty breeze, appreciating his leisurely stroll along the coast. His host didn't know where exactly their destination was, but according to the others, there was still some ground left to cover. For Marnock and his crewmates, this island might very well be a death trap, but for Mickey, it was just the beautiful setting for another of his many adventures. One of the more relaxing ones, too. I should still try to get the new spell down before we enter the jungle, he reminded himself. The concealment rune might save Marnock's life later. While Mickey wasn't above enjoying his time here, he wasn't going to willingly sabotage his new buddy's survival prospects out of laziness or nonchalance. He turned his attention back to the half-formed enchantment inside his host's core. As difficult as it was to control one's mana internally, Mickey was more than a little skilled at doing precisely that. His elemental body on Remir had to do something similar every time he wanted to shift his ice mana between its 3 states, and that was without taking into account all the other permutations of precasting that he could apply in battle. On top of that, drawing a single rune was pretty much the simplest expression of Magiscript possible, even without his spectral trait helping him. With it, shaping the air mana into the circular symbol was more than manageable. Drawing the rune isn't the problem, he noted. The biggest issue is the rest of the mana messing the enchantment up. Mana cores contained a mage's entire reserves, holding enough power to conjure up some pretty violent spells even as early as yellow, let alone the higher grades. And all of that energy was normally stored inside a volume no larger than a strawberry. Consequently, even the slightest push could cause the mana to thrash wildly inside the organ. This was why precasting was so difficult to master in the first place. Manipulating the mana with any finesse required a gentle touch. Things were still simple when it came to more straightforward transformations like rotations or splitting the flow into multiple parts, but even the most basic runes had a relatively intricate shape. Worse still, while Mickey's trait helped him control the mana tied to the enchantment, it had nothing to say about the rest of his reserves. Then again, that was only to be expected, given its description. Ascribing boosts one's proclivity in expressing meaning onto any written medium. Thankfully, scribing was rather lax when determining what counted as a written medium, having allowed Mickey to do all sorts of interesting things with it in the past. However, the definition didn't seem to extend to indirect help. It could force the mana into the correct shape, but it couldn't prevent a separate stream of mana from distorting it. It's ridiculous that I thought I wouldn't have to worry about the environment disturbing the enchantments, he lamented, the corner of his host's lips curling into a bitter frown. There's no worse environment than the interior of a mana core. There was a silver lining, however. Mickey had once again discovered how profound the vault's runecrafting language was. The circular runes fit neatly inside the spherical core, making use of every square millimeter of its cross-section. Had he used any other language, he would have had to make the runes smaller to make them fit, weakening their effects and wasting space. He was pretty sure that it was just a coincidence. He didn't think that Metatron knew about precasting, and he sure hoped that the Titan hadn't even considered the possibility of elevating circulation into an artificial promotion. As long as Tlaloc and Leo keep their mouths shut about the dance, it would be too great a leap of logic. Then again, it was entirely possible that Mickey's friends had already let the information slip. Perhaps he shouldn't be underestimating Metatron's ingenuity either. Whether the god had realized it or not, he already had access to many of the tools that Mickey was planning to use in his project. The only ones that he might lack were the spectral traits and the alchemic principles, but Metatron could still potentially find workarounds. Well, there's nothing I can do about it now. Even if he gets there before I do, it won't affect me immediately. As long as I can become a god, I'll be able to deal with him one day. Either way, Mickey already knew the Titan's main reasons for building his entire runecrafting language on circular shapes, and they had nothing to do with mana cores. It made the enchantments simpler to draw and easier to stack together, both things that Mickey had grown to greatly appreciate after years of experience in the field. Regardless of Metatron's motivations, Mickey had to admit that the runes were practically perfect for what he wanted to do. Even if he stopped holding the enchantments in place, they would be able to keep spinning inside the core with no obstruction. Wait, spinning? That could work, he thought, causing his host's heart to skip a beat. Mickey had been trying way too hard to keep the runes still, but that only made it more difficult for them to weather the violent flows of mana inside the organ. What if he stopped resisting and just allowed the symbols to rotate freely? Deciding to give that a shot, he repaired the damaged enchantment once more, this time letting go of the circle's circumference. Like a flicked coin, the rune began revolving rapidly, falling apart within mere seconds. This was precisely what Mickey had feared would happen, though he keenly noticed that the symbol had survived a little longer than his previous attempts. Seeing that his latest idea had merit, he repeated his actions, adjusting his mindset slightly. He couldn't afford to let go of the rune entirely, or it would crumble on the spot. He still had to put some effort into keeping it intact, though he should probably avoid squeezing it as tightly. Its shape has to stay fixed, but its angular momentum and orientation don't really matter. The second attempt went a little better, the rune lasting for over 5 seconds before getting ripped apart. Thankfully, the wind crashing against it didn't apply as much pressure when Mickey allowed the symbol to move freely, though a new problem soon presented itself. Focusing on the enchantment was difficult. It revolved dozens, if not hundreds of times per second, and it did so randomly in all 3 dimensions. Mickey was only able to hold on to the rune for a while due to his trait. Unlike the conscious part of his mind that struggled to keep track of the construct, the instincts granted to him by scribing didn't seem to care about whether the symbol was upside down, flipped horizontally, or spinning. Leaning into that feeling, Mickey stopped trying to sense the rune directly. Ignoring the feeling in his host's chest entirely, he allowed a static picture of the concealment rune to form in his mind, a perfect representation of the enchantment inside his core, stripped of the movements. He could still feel how the symbol was being affected by its surroundings, but he had essentially aligned his thoughts with the rune's frame of reference. He experienced the erratic air mana slamming into the construct as a series of violent gales, hitting it from every direction in an attempt to tear it down. They feel weaker than before, though, he realized, suppressing the urge to grin. 10 seconds passed. The enchantment remained intact as Mickey shattered his previous record. The gales didn't just crash onto the rune, however. They also collided with one another, brewing a chaotic storm inside the organ. The enchantment wasn't spinning at a fixed speed, nor in a single direction. It constantly accelerated and decelerated, its rotation fluctuating wildly from one moment to the next. Every major shift threatened to throw Mickey off, and to undo the symbol's structure, each sudden change impossible to predict or prepare for. Mickey was hanging on for dear life, like a boat trying to stay afloat atop a tumultuous ocean. He filtered all the detrimental information out, concentrating on nothing but the rune itself as he poured his mind into keeping every last stroke of the magical symbol in place. Whenever the shape felt like it was about to twist, he clamped down on it just a touch harder, letting go again as soon as the storm eased. A minute passed, and then another, he guessed so at least, though he was too preoccupied with the difficult task to keep track. Mickey's mind constantly alternated between tense and relaxed, almost as if he was wrestling with a tireless hurricane, struggling to block its violent blows with everything he had. Thankfully, the situation improved markedly over time. It never got easy per se, but it did get a little easier after a while. About an hour in, Mickey wasn't as worried about the enchantment falling apart anymore. Maintaining its shape still required a lot of effort, but he was feeling increasingly confident that he could keep it up for a very long time if he didn't break focus, and his status seemed to agree with that assessment. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Spectral art. Internal runecrafting, refined. Straight to refined. Huh? Not bad, Mickey thought, pressing his excitement down before it showed on his host's expression by mistake. The last thing Marnock needed was to have to explain to his crewmates why he was the only one thrilled to be starving on a deserted island. Thinking back to the spell, Mickey had to admit that he wasn't all that surprised by its classification. The new field of Magiscript that he had just invented had an extremely high barrier of entry. In fact, he wasn't sure that his latest spectral art was easier to cast than his instantaneous formation, and his status had listed that one as masterful. At the same time, he understood that Phoebe's decree took several things into consideration when registering a new spell. Complexity was an important factor for sure, but so was potency. Viewed from that angle, the powerful formation that he had used to bring down one of Thescala's most talented disciples was worlds apart from his latest trick. Internal runecrafting demanded his undivided attention for a prolonged period of time and didn't even give him that much in return. Right now, the best he could manage was to replicate the effect of a cheap concealment bandage, something that even a novice enchanter could prepare with ease. Oh well, it's still proof of concept that my idea has merit. Every new field has to start somewhere, he consoled himself. All things considered, Mickey did have a vague plan on how he was going to upgrade his boosting art. Ideally, it would serve as a direct improvement over the original dance of the Savage Gods, not the carnival, the symbol, or the symphony. Those were even more powerful, but they were tailored to Mickey's unique combination of cores, affinities, and other abilities. He didn't want to create the new spell merely for his own sake. His ancestors on Huehue had originally intended to elevate the technique further, though Raziel and his goons had prevented them from ever completing their project. I'll do it for them, and for Remir too. Mickey wanted to pick up where the gods had left off, creating a spell that worked for every affinity, just like circulation and the dance. The latter already provided a person with enough mana capacity and regeneration to touch upon the next grade, but the boost was temporary and incomplete. The next step would be to truly compress the mana to the next grade, which Mickey guessed would bring about a much deeper physical enhancement, extending one's lifespan like a regular promotion. His recent ventures in potion-making had already given him a blueprint to follow. Conveniently, his spherical cauldron was shaped just like a mana core, so many of the key details would hopefully translate quite well from one application to the other. Mana cores are complex and delicate organs, though, he reminded himself. I'll need to be careful to avoid any injuries, and make sure that the core still works properly afterwards. Normally, mana cores couldn't compress or support mana of the next grade. The whole point of drinking elixirs was to cleanse them until they could. Mickey would have to use runes to pick up the slack. He'd also have to make the organs gather and compress mana automatically, otherwise his grade would drop the moment he stopped paying attention. Finally, he doubted that he would be able to force more than a single artificial advancement. Much like his cauldron was currently limited to potions just 2 grades higher, Mickey knew that he wouldn't be able to strengthen the organs endlessly with Magiscript alone. This meant that he'd have to continue cleansing his cores the good old way, drinking Aurora Dew multiple times per day, working towards his next natural promotion. And he didn't want to keep removing and reapplying the runes, so he'd have to design them in a way that didn't interfere with beast mana. There are several major problems that I'll have to solve, Mickey thought. He'd have to plan the enchantments out and buy whatever books he was missing from the vault. He'd also have to get countless times better at drawing them, because struggling to keep a single rune active inside his core just wouldn't cut it. If you encounter this narrative on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. More importantly, he'd have to find a way of making the enchantments permanent, since he couldn't afford to actively maintain them. One option would be to use solid mana types. Between crystallization and ice mana, his body's already technically had the means to craft permanent enchantments inside his own cores, but that went against his hopes of making the spell usable by every affinity. I wonder whether a mortal can learn to craft solid seals like Metatrons, he thought, creasing his host's brow. The spatial seal that the Titan had sold him was made entirely out of space mana, and Mickey was pretty sure that wasn't normally a solid mana type. If he could copy the god's methods, he'd have the means to turn every single affinity into a solid material to forge his enchantments out of. Pondering over this some more, Mickey felt that it was a viable approach, though it created a bunch of new issues. Leaving aside whether he was even capable of learning Metatron's technique, he had no idea whether the Titan would be willing to sell him the information. I'll have to look into this the next time I'm there. If I can't buy it with credits, maybe I can claim it from the reward pools after clearing the 6th wave of the challenges. If it wasn't in the red or orange pools, it might be in the yellow or green ones. Gabe had even managed to get a demigod's soul mana that way, so Mickey felt good about his odds. And even if the information wasn't in the system, he could still try trading Metatron something for it. Once he had everything he needed from the vault, it would be time to essentially perform alchemy inside his cores. The thought of treating his own body like a cauldron was quite scary, but it should be safe as long as he approached it with sufficient caution. As soon as he had something that worked, he would need to solve the issue with the elixirs too. I suppose that I can't keep relying on the scribing trait forever either, otherwise the spell won't be usable by other people. That wasn't a priority, of course. It was already going to be extremely difficult to reach his goal with the trait's help, let alone without it. So Mickey wasn't in a rush to get rid of his spectral crutches just yet. Even so, he was happy with the plan. It would admittedly involve a lot of challenging steps, but Mickey didn't see any of them as insurmountable. He'd just have to tackle them one at a time, which wasn't anything new to him. Most of those things can wait until later anyway. Right now, the best use of my time is to help Marnock while getting better with internal runecrafting. Mickey was about to resume working on his spell when he noticed that something had changed in the outside world. The sailors had stopped walking at some point, having probably reached the spot along the coastline closest to their destination. They'd gathered up, staring at the jungle ahead while discussing how to proceed. Some wanted to do things more cautiously, to get in, find something edible, and immediately return to the beach. They weren't necessarily against heading toward the saint's tomb eventually, but they wanted to take their sweet time preparing for it. They didn't want to risk it until everyone was fully fed and rested, and they had slowly mapped out the area. Others disagreed, insisting on going straight for the treasure. Apparently, their information already gave them a good idea of where it was located, and they reasoned that it was best to spend as little time inside the jungle as possible. Caution was good, but not if it meant giving the monsters dwelling in the depths of the island more chances to ambush them. Mickey didn't much care what the sailors ended up choosing, his attention shifting to his host's surroundings. The beach wasn't as empty anymore at some point. A few boulders of various sizes had appeared, jutting out of the sand. They were sleek and pitch black, most of them sporting irregular shapes that left no doubt that they had been formed naturally. He keenly noticed a few with oddly canonical shapes, however, giving him a weird feeling. Mickey wouldn't call them half-spherical exactly, and their texture didn't look any different from the regular boulders, but he thought that they appeared a little too similar to one another. Scanning them with mana sense, he came up empty. No wonder the other sailors hadn't thought much of the objects. Was he really just imagining things? Wanting to be sure, he searched inside his spatial seal, finding a tiny piece of his scythe that he'd managed to salvage earlier. It was barely as long as his index finger, and he didn't have a single drop of phantom mana left to repair it. Even if he tried to forcefully feed air mana into the adaptive runes, he guessed that they would distort the construct's shape into something unrecognizable long before he managed to regrow the weapon. The scythe wasn't the point, however. Quietly summoning the object to his host's hand, he clenched his fist, shattering the construct. Mickey ignored the gray powder trickling through the gaps in his fingers. He couldn't uncrystallize his mana, but his reinforced weapons contained traces of soft mana as well. There wasn't much, though he was able to send a tiny amount to his host's eyes, activating soul vision. The magical sense only flashed for a fraction of a second before fizzling out, yet it was just about long enough to give Mickey a better glimpse into the strange rocks. The sight that had unfolded before him sent a chill down his borrowed spine. A silver silhouette burned patiently inside each of the oddly shaped boulders. Mickey had to stop his host from yelling. "We need to warn him," Marnock protested. "We do, but you need to calm down first. Panicking will only make the situation worse," Mickey said. He didn't think there was any chance that the creatures were planning to let them go. The endless hunger that came hand in hand with their affinity simply wouldn't allow them to ignore such a feast. If anything, it was surprising that they'd even held out this long, though Mickey understood that was just a behavior that they must have evolved after countless generations, to better their odds of getting a meal. Judging from their sizes, most of them were at yellow or orange, and they appeared to outnumber the sailors 3-1. Mickey could see the fight going either way, but the outcome would largely depend on how they handled it. The creatures likely understood that too. The only reason they hadn't attacked yet was probably because they wanted to lure the men even deeper into their ranks, to surround them from every direction. Their shells clearly concealed their mana signatures, the monsters having long learned the value of patience. Mickey was willing to bet good money that the creatures would drop the facade in a heartbeat the moment Marnock's people raised a big fuss or attempted to run away. "What should we do?" Marnock asked upon listening to Mickey's explanation. "First things first. How close are you to activating the new core?" "'Tis ready," his host replied. "I've only kept the last channel half closed like you told me." Mickey nodded internally. "Good. Activate it. No matter what affinity we get, the physical boost should come in handy." While Marnock worked on awakening the organ, Mickey paid attention to the sailors' conversation. They were still locked in a heated discussion, trying to decide whether to prioritize food or treasure, and how to better manage the risk. The poor fools had yet to realize that food and risk had both already found them. Either way, the situation suited Mickey just fine. The more his host's crewmates dragged on, the more time he and Marnock had to prepare. Of course, there was always a chance that the monsters would get sick of waiting before they were ready, but there was nothing he could do about that. About a minute later, their core contained enough mana for Mickey to get a feel for its type. He'd experienced most affinities enough times to recognize them by now, though he wasn't necessarily as proficient with all of them. Thankfully, Lady Luck appeared to smile on him for once. "Water, nice." It was merely a common affinity which shouldn't come as a surprise, really, but also the best one he could have asked for. Not only was he extremely familiar with it, he was also skilled at manipulating its combination with air. Fusing the elements from two separate cores was bound to feel a little different from having a single core with the composite affinity, but he'd played with enough cores and bodies in the past that he should be able to figure it out quickly enough if necessary. As an added bonus, he wouldn't have to worry about Marnock going thirsty if anything bad happened to the other water users in the group. Along with the new organ came the familiar boost to Marnock's physique. Their muscles grew twice as strong, their mind clearer and their senses sharper. Mickey didn't wait for his host to fill his core up, rushing to shape its contents into a concealment rune before the others noticed the oddity. "What are you doing? Ain't we going to use the water mana?" the sailor asked. "Only if we have to. No need to reveal all our trump cards before absolutely necessary," Mickey replied. Keeping the enchantment from falling apart was a lot harder while Marnock was actively drawing mana to the organ, though that should stop being a problem as soon as it was full. Either way, the added difficulty was offset by the fact that water mana was a lot calmer and slower. It didn't affect Mickey's efforts nearly as much as air, and even though the currents inside the organ felt heavier, their movements weren't nearly as dizzying. In hindsight, there weren't many affinities more troublesome to precast than air. Perhaps Mickey should have waited for a different host before attempting this. The story has been illicitly taken. Should you find it on Amazon, report the infringement. Oh well, what's done is done. It was good practice anyway. Besides, I'll need to learn how to do this with every affinity at some point. He thought with a mental shrug. Turning to his host, he said, I won't be able to focus on much else while I'm doing this, so make sure you survive. Marnock nodded, before interrupting his bickering crewmates.
Oh.
Shut your traps for a moment. The sailors threw him curious glances, but he ignored them. No matter what I'm about to say, I need you to remain calm. Black rocks around ya? Most of 'em ain't rocks. The smaller ones are beasts. Bidden their time to bite AR faces off. Ave, you lost it, Marnock? Beasts can't survive without mana cores. And I don't see any. One of the men said with a smirk. Did the lack of food get to ya? Many of the others snickered, only a couple looking like they were taking Marnock seriously. Just listen. If I'm wrong, you can Ave a laugh at me expense later. But if I'm right, we're in big trouble. Good news is that we ain't got to go looking for food. We can eat plenty air. What do you suggest? The man with the red bandana asked, clearly belonging to the group more willing to entertain Marnock's madness. Keep talking so don't realize we're onto him. Whatever happens, don't try to run neither. Does Nyon think can get through shells? I reckon only Earth users can crack through big ones. Maybe fire can cook alive if we're lucky. But we should all be able to handle small ones, another sailor said. Marnock nodded.
Ignorem boulder shaped like actual rocks.
We all attack on me signal focusing on those to me left. We need to carve a path back the way we came so that we don't get surrounded. Everyone good. Some of the sailors seemed more willing to entertain Marnock's proposition than others, though they all eventually nodded. Even the ones still thinking that this was a joke probably understood that they had nothing to lose if he was wrong and everything to lose if he was right. Now! Marnock yelled, unleashing a green crescent blade at the nearest semispherical rock, the spell cleaving about halfway through the glossy shell before coming to a halt. Blue blood spilled out of the crack, providing ample evidence that he'd been telling the truth. Not that the others needed it, as they'd already attacked several other creatures. A few Earth users ganged up on one of the yellow beasts. Its shell appeared even tougher than expected, the constructs unable to break through. The sailors settled for trapping the monster between a few stone pillars, its carapace barely cracking slightly where it collided with the spells. One of the fire users pitched in, finishing it off by pouring mana into the holes. Things weren't looking great, however. This was about to turn into a massacre if every creature required several people working together to take down. The other sailors either attacked the smaller beasts or tried to push the larger ones aside, focusing on opening a path instead of wasting their time and mana failing to deal any actual damage. The beasts didn't sit idly either. As soon as the men began attacking them, dozens of previously still stones shifted at once, chitinous limbs unfolding one after the other. Sharp legs tapped rapidly against the sand, the crab-like creatures moving much faster than Mickey had expected. Each sported 2 pairs of giant pincers, the limbs stretching twice as long as the crabs' bodies, the afternoon sun giving their serrated edges an ominous red sheen as they clicked loudly. In mere moments, the army of creatures crashed into the group of marooned sailors like a tidal wave, the men doing everything they could to resist the onslaught while moving backwards. Beasts fell one after the other, the orange creatures doing so far more frequently than the yellows. Unfortunately, Marnock's crewmates experienced plenty of casualties themselves. The first to fall was one of the sick orangeborns. Mickey wasn't sure whether it had been the man's grade or illness that had caused him to miss a step. Either way, the poor sailor's leg ended up caught by an oversized pincer, causing him to lose both his foot and his footing, 2 massive crabs soon ripping him apart with savage glee. The second orangeborn performed a little better than his dead companion, even managing to outlive a couple of yellow-born sailors before succumbing himself. While the sailors lacked the numbers or the tough exteriors of their opponents, they had a few advantages of their own to fall back to. Unlike the bulky creatures that kept getting in each other's way, the men could stack their spells together a lot more easily. Retreating methodically, they bought themselves time to slowly whittle down the monsters. Before long, all the orange beasts were dead, the sailors managing to open up a path out of the encirclement. They should be able to outrun the crabs if they chose to escape, but nobody seemed willing to do that. Whether it was out of a desire to avenge their fallen comrades, unwillingness to let all this food to go to waste, or pure spite toward the insidious creatures, the sailors decided to stay and fight, their coordinated spells gradually turning the battle in their favor. The crabs found it increasingly difficult to approach, dying one after the other as the men took turns holding the line or recovering their mana. Mickey never felt the need to pitch in, focusing solely on his internal runecrafting throughout the battle. It was valuable experience, and it wasn't like an extra water mage would have made a huge difference. Exposing his host's second core would only bring them trouble down the line. Marnock never attempted to use his new mana type either. Leaving aside the fact that Mickey had explicitly instructed him not to, he probably didn't even know how to wield the affinity properly. Certainly not at the same time as his air mana. However, his newly strengthened body definitely made a difference, allowing him to position himself better, preventing him from falling behind his companions and getting devoured by the monsters. By the time the sun was about to set, the Earth users joined forces one final time to pin the last crab between a bunch of constructs, the beast letting out a screeching cry as the fire users emptied their cores inside its carapace. The sailors had won the gruesome battle and even found themselves some dinner, or at least the 8 of them still breathing had. The irony of getting ambushed by a group of beasts that hid their mana cores while he himself was working on a similar ability wasn't lost on Mickey. As soon as the battle was over, the survivors looted a few shards from the crab's shells to fix into their clothes, to hopefully mask their mana signatures in the coming days. In a way, this rendered Mickey's previous efforts moot, though he hadn't been practicing internal runecrafting just for Marnock's sake. The group was rightfully distraught after losing nearly half of their members again, yet nobody complained much. Today's casualties were barely a drop in the bucket compared to the hundreds of people who had died the day before. Each survivor contributed in whatever way he could, to clean up the mess and get some much-needed rest as soon as possible. Marnock and another air user worked together to funnel the stench of death and decay toward the ocean, to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the land-dwelling creatures. The only remaining water user, or well, the only one that the other sailors knew about, washed away the bloodstains on the sand, while 2 Earth users were in charge of burying the bodies and building a makeshift camp for the group. It might have been more prudent to move away from the battlefield before more monsters arrived in search of food, but the sailors were too tired to travel or carry the heavy carcasses. 2 fire mages took it upon themselves to roast the orange crabs. The larger specimens were too tough to eat, but the sailors didn't rush to get rid of them. They hoped to offer them as tribute to any invading beasts, to hopefully avoid further bloodshed tonight. There weren't any pure or lightning mages left. There had been some, but none had made it through the battle. All the sick men had died too. Mickey didn't think it was a coincidence that the sailors with the lower grades, weaker affinities, or impaired physical conditions had been among the first to perish. Just the indifference of nature doing its cruel job, he sighed. Much to his host's relief, Flammy was the 8th survivor. The life mage hadn't been able to do much against the crabs directly, but his crewmates had gone out of their way to protect their only healer, and he'd returned the favor by keeping everyone in decent condition throughout the battle. He was currently walking toward Marnock to do more of that, his hand ablaze with the green glow of life mana. "I'm good, mate," Mickey hurriedly said after seizing control of his host's mouth. "The others need your help more," he added, making sure to emulate Marnock's speech pattern to the best of his ability. He pointed to another sailor that sported a couple of nasty gashes on his left leg, just below his knee. Flammy nodded, quietly moving to heal the injured man as a mental frown bubbled up through Marnock's soul. "Who says no to free healin'? I know we're doing better than most, but I wouldn't mind getting some of me fatigue washed away, you know?" Mickey felt the urge to roll his eyes. "I've still got plenty of healing potions left," he said, emptying a few doses into his host's stomach. The orange liquid had grown even less effective on Marnock after he awakened his second core, but relieving some tension from his muscles wasn't an issue. If you'd rather waste your potions than to get patched up for free, who am I to judge?" Marnock replied with a shrug. As soon as everyone was done with their respective tasks, the sailors feasted in relative silence around the campfire, only speaking briefly to discuss their plans for tomorrow. The thought of venturing into the jungle with nearly half the men they'd started out with filled everyone with unconcealed dread. Yet reaching the saint's tomb might be their only shot at surviving the island. Not that the demigod's treasure was guaranteed to save them, but the alternatives were far less promising. Nobody knew how long it would be before their commodore sent more ships after them, and they didn't think that they'd be able to survive on the coast for weeks or months. Maybe even years. You might be reading a pirated copy. Look for the official release to support the author. At least we no longer need food. We'll save a lot of time if we eddy straight there. One of them concluded, getting a round of nods back. Half the sailors went to sleep, Marnock and Flammy included. Or at least the former pretended to do so, to avoid having to explain his willingness to keep watch for a second night in a row. Closing their eyes, Mickey and his host rested on the soft sand, listening to the soothing sound of the waves and the hushed whispers of the sailors on guard duty. "A couple of them are coughing again," Mickey noticed, suppressing a frown. They weren't the same people as yesterday. Those men had already died. Worse still, the newly afflicted sailors were all yellow-borns, which was a terrible omen if Mickey had seen one. Granted, he already had some guesses as to what was causing this, but he lacked enough evidence to be certain. Deciding to sit on the information a little longer, he ignored everyone else, turning his attention inwards again. The fact that Marnock no longer needed the concealment runes lifted some pressure off Mickey's non-existent shoulders, but that didn't deter him from resuming work on his project. He still had a long way to go before his new skill was at a satisfactory level for his goals. A single rune isn't challenging enough anymore. I need to push myself further, he realized. Maintaining the enchantment still took a lot of effort, but his improvements had slowed down noticeably after having kept the rune active for the past few hours. Clearly, he'd have to keep raising the bar if he didn't want to stagnate. Adding more runes was a no-brainer, but Mickey had no idea how he was meant to draw multiple enchantments side by side inside the spherical core. Instead, he opted for enchantments that involved multiple runes stacked over one another. The most obvious next step was a controlled concealment rune. He started by forming one in his host's water core, to ease the transition, only switching to the air core about an hour later. The process hadn't changed much, but the shape in his mind was a little more complex, forcing him to expend more effort to hold it together. Over the next couple of hours, Mickey moved on to other types of controlled enchantments, drawing each one inside Marnock's water core first, before scrapping it and switching to the more challenging air core, getting faster and better with every attempt. About halfway through the night, he realized that trying different runes wasn't helping as much anymore. Deciding to increase the difficulty again, he drew one of his favorite enchantments, and one that involved 2 intricate runes rather than 1.5, a self-repair. Mickey had considered the possibility of using internal self-repairs to somehow accelerate his advancements in the past, though he'd long concluded that it wouldn't work. Mana cores couldn't be repaired with just mana. Even if he could somehow get the memory runes to store the organ's blueprint before a cleansing session and the growth runes to restore it afterwards, the enchantment would most likely bring back all the purged impurities, essentially reversing the effect of the elixir. If he did that, Mickey would only be wasting time and beast mana. He just couldn't imagine a way to mend the cracks in the core the right way, other than feeding them crystallized pure mana, which his Aurora Dew already did. Come to think of it, none of my current enchantments are particularly useful when paired with the new spell, he realized. Other than the concealment runes that could be used in niche situations, the only others that might come close were heat runes, pressure runes, or structural integrity enchantments. Heat runes could potentially be used to warm up his body if he ended up stuck in a cold environment with a low grade and an affinity incapable of generating heat by itself. The pressure runes might allow him to expel mana more forcefully from his body, to perhaps strengthen his spells slightly. Of course, he could achieve something similar with regular precasting, and he wasn't even sure that the organ would be able to endure the strain. As for the structural integrity enchantments, they could potentially shield his cores from harm, though he struggled to think of many situations where that would be handy. I guess that they can be combined with pressure runes to offset the damage. It would arguably be too much effort for too little gain. That said, both the structural integrity enchantments and the pressure runes would be part of his eventual artificial promotion, so testing this out sounded like a nice milestone to aim towards. I'll worry about that later. Right now, even the self-repair is difficult to draw, he decided, shaking the pointless thoughts off. It took Mickey 2 hours just to get the enchantment to work inside Marnok's second core, and another to resist the violent air mana in his first. Mickey was debating internally whether to try a controlled self-repair next, or to go back to the simpler concealment runes but keep them active in both cores at the same time when he got interrupted. The first rays of the morning sun licked his host's face gently, the other sailors calling out to him, slightly less gently.
Oi, Marnok.
We're about to head out. Mickey took a short break from his runecrafting, he and his host stretching their limbs, taking a few deep breaths of the salty breeze, and eating a couple slices of dried crab meat. It was finally time to trek to the saint's tomb. The sailors moved cautiously through the jungle, heading straight toward the nearest lake. Apparently, there were 3 of them on the island, the largest one sporting a crescent shape like a person's grin, the other 2 perfectly circular. From the sky, the island looked like a skull, which was precisely how it had received the name that it was labeled by on most maps, at least according to the sailors who had actually seen said maps, though Marnok and, by proxy, Mickey had only heard about this from the others. The tomb was supposedly buried beneath the lake that made up the skull's right eye. No wonder it hasn't been discovered in so long, Mickey had thought upon hearing about it. He didn't doubt that the people of Rabari had turned their whole planet upside down in search of the hidden stashes of Fool's Amber, but few would think to dig beneath a random body of water on some remote island without a hint. Technically, the lake was only a couple dozen kilometers away from the spot where the sailors had fought the crabs. After all, the marooned crew had spent the better part of the previous day circling the island precisely to shorten the distance as much as possible. The trek still took a while as the 8 men traveled cautiously, masking their cores and dulling their steps as best as they could. They'd even covered their bodies with mud to get rid of their scent, and kept their mouths shut, for the most part, to avoid drawing any attention. If there was one thing that wasn't going in their favor, it was the sailors' intermittent coughs that kept echoing through the dense undergrowth. The afflicted men had wrapped strips of fabric around their mouths to stifle the sound, though there was a limit to how much cloth they could stuff in their faces without suffocating. As for where they'd found the excess fabric, well, let's just say that their deceased crewmates wouldn't be needing their shirts moving forward. They wouldn't be needing their boots either, which was why Marnok had borrowed a pair. Is it me? Or are there more people coughing again? Mickey wondered, letting his host's lips curl into a frown. Last night, it had only been 2, but another 3 had since joined their ranks. Flammy was among them, which Marnok wasn't particularly happy about, clearly worried about his friend's health. Luckily, Mickey and his host hadn't felt anything odd yet. Start coughing, Mickey told Marnok at some point. What? The sailor asked, his soul flaring with surprise at the strange request. You heard me, Mickey replied. And once you begin, make sure you keep it up, or the others will know you're faking it. But why? Because, if I'm right about this, your friends will soon be asking why you're the only one who's okay. Marnok didn't seem entirely convinced, but he heeded Mickey's instructions regardless. The group continued to advance slowly through the jungle, prioritizing caution over speed. Had they sprinted toward the lake, the trip wouldn't have taken them longer than an hour. However, they opted to travel without raising a stir, and while carefully scanning every patch of dirt they stepped over. Despite the delay, they should be reaching their destination by noon. Mickey only paid attention to them intermittently, spending most of his time working on the new spell. He had already managed to form and sustain a controlled self-repair enchantment in his host's water core, though getting it to work inside the air core was proving rather difficult. That was why he'd taken a break from pushing for more complex runes, instead switching his efforts to multitasking. Right now, he was trying to form concealment runes in both organs. The one in Marnok's second core was already complete, yet forcing the other one into shape wasn't easy. Maybe I should try doing it the other way around? It might be easier to draw the rune in the water core while holding one steady in the air core. Strictly speaking, this particular exercise wasn't very relevant to his project. His artificial advancement would certainly involve enchantments far more complex than his controlled self-repairs, so that part of his training was necessary, but he wouldn't need to draw them in multiple cores at once. As soon as he learned how to give his rune substance, he should have the means to upgrade his organs one at a time. However, Mickey felt that any practice was good. Even if an exercise didn't have an obvious application, it would help him spot and fix flaws in his technique that he hadn't even noticed. He was about to test out his new idea when a sudden scream pierced the jungle, drawing everyone's attention. Several heads, including Marnok's, snapped toward the noise, Mickey soon realizing that one of their crew members was missing. Of course, mana sense was often more reliable than regular vision. Marnok soon revealed the location of the unfortunate sailor, the crab shells hiding his core having shifted from his sternum. Guided by his sixth sense, Mickey's gaze followed their crewmate's mana signature up a tall tree, his host's eyes widening upon landing on the man's mutilated body. A giant shape was slowly coiling around his torso, squeezing the life out of him. The sailor's bones audibly cracked with every centimeter the foreign mass traveled, his swollen flesh twitching in pain as blood oozed out of countless wounds. However, the poor sailor couldn't let out another sound. A massive maw having already swallowed the upper third of his body, two yellow orbs shining on its head with unconcealed malice. Some kind of snake? It's huge, Mickey thought as he tried to fathom the creature's entire length. Its body stretched and twisted through the crowns of nearly every tree in the area, its girth thicker than the numerous trunks supporting its weight. It was so long, in fact, that Mickey wasn't sure whether it was a single beast or a whole pack of them. If it was just one specimen, it had to be at green, though he struggled to read its grade. Gasps and horrified shrieks broke the oppressive silence of the jungle once again as the surviving sailors stepped closer to one another, nearly pressing their backs together and facing outwards. "How in the reefs did we miss it?" one of them asked, his voice shaking. That was a great question. The abomination was practically everywhere, and yet it had somehow eluded all 8 of their mana senses for such a long time. Scanning it more carefully, Mickey noticed that its pitch-black body wasn't covered in scales exactly, but rather something else. Shards of a material that appeared oddly familiar. Come to think of it, didn't it look exactly like the fragmented shells that Marnok and his crewmates were using to hide their own cores? The pieces were rough and irregular, seemingly attached to the monster's body rather than naturally grown. Mickey saw traces of a pale liquid spilling slowly through the gaps, thick, viscous, and sticky, like molten wax, holding the stolen carapaces in place. Swallowing hard, Mickey was about to instruct Marnok and the other sailors to attack the creature while it was still busy with its meal, when he saw something else that caused the blood to freeze in his host's veins. Mickey had instinctively thought of the beast as some kind of snake, but this wasn't Remir. His preconceived notions clearly couldn't be trusted. The monster's elongated body didn't run across a single straight line. It forked at a certain spot, splitting into 3 ways. One segment clearly led to the head currently devouring the unlucky sailor. Another likely ended up as the creature's tail, somewhere far in the distance. As for the last one, Mickey's borrowed eyes darted across the canopies as he frantically followed the abomination's body to its 3rd extremity. The colossal beast stretched too far, winding through countless gaps in the dense foliage, almost forming a second layer of jungle overlaying the first one. To Mickey's great horror, his search eventually led him right above his host. Rivers of transparent saliva gushed out of a jaw hung so wide it might as well have been a cave, rows of curved fangs glinting with hunger as a second pair of yellow orbs shone upon Marnok. "Damn!" Mickey spat, shoving the others aside as he rolled along the dry dirt, barely dodging the monster's strike. The enormous mass crashed into the ground where Marnock had just stood with enough force to shake the entire area, the surrounding trees still vibrating a couple of seconds later. Mickey felt his host's eardrums nearly split, watching the earth crack as the violent impact raised a cloud of dust. The creature's fangs remained lodged deep in the dirt, getting ripped out of their owner's maw as it pulled its head up, blue blood spilling out of its torn gums. Mickey didn't get a chance to celebrate his opponent's defanging, countless new fangs soon sprouting to replace them. The beast was clearly built for precisely this sort of thing. The other sailors finally decided to make themselves useful, a barrage of spells of 4 separate affinities flying toward the creature. Little good it did them, however, the projectiles splashing harmlessly against the stolen fragments, never so much as touching the monster's actual body. "Focus your attacks at the same spot," Mickey yelled. "We'll never kill it if we shoot randomly." He wasn't sure whether the others had heard him through the cacophony of the battle. Trees snapped in two every time the snake moved, colorful flashes blinding everyone as boulders, fireballs, green crescents and streams of water pelted the beast's armored hide, plunging the jungle into complete chaos. Thankfully, their attacks soon converged where the monster's neck split. Whether they had heard Mickey or not, Marnock's crewmates clearly had the same idea as him. Nobody knew whether the monster could survive with a single head, so their best bet was to make sure that they severed both at once. Mickey actively assisted his host this time, making full use of his water mana. He no longer cared whether anyone noticed. They were probably too busy to pay attention to him anyway, and he guessed that they would be more than happy to swallow whatever explanation Marnock gave them later as long as they survived. Perhaps he'd pack more firepower if he seized Marnock's other core too and fused the mana types into ice. But he decided that he'd rather have a second mind helping him than a composite affinity. Everyone's priority was to keep track of the creature's head, as it posed the greatest threat to the group by far. At least, it had yet to demonstrate the ability to attack with any other body part. However, avoiding its blows grew twice as hard as soon as the monster was done devouring its meal, freeing up its second head. The second sailor fell almost immediately. It was one of the Earth users, increasing the pressure on the others once again. The good news was that their attacks eventually yielded some results, peeling off the layer of chitin, shielding the intersection of the beast's necks. The opening exposed a much softer body hiding beneath, translucent and slimy like a slug's. The sticky fluid was already flowing along the creature's length, dragging more of the glossy fragments with it, the monster clearly trying to repair its broken armor. "Like hell I'll let ya," the last of the Earth users shouted, emptying his core to fire a massive stone spear into the creature's hide, stabbing into its vulnerable exterior. Only, the sailor had left himself wide open in his eagerness. Worse still, he didn't have a drop of mana left to protect himself with. Others tried to save him, but the snake's fangs tore through their hastily crafted constructs as if they were paper, snapping around the man's body and leaving his torso riddled with holes. To his credit, the sailor retained enough clarity of mind to will the spear to shatter with his dying breath, giving his crewmates an opening to pour their attacks directly into the creature's body. "Come on, just die already?" another yelled, hurling a fireball into the hole. The abomination writhed in agony, apparently realizing that it was about to lose its life. It pulled both of its heads back, going as far as to let go of the mangled corpse still in its maw. Its serpentine frame moved along the tree's crowns as it attempted to untangle itself from the jungle and slither away. Marnock's companions showed no interest in letting it go, however. They ran behind it, continuing to shower its body with spells, trying to aim for the opening that their fallen comrade had sacrificed his life to create. Most of their attacks missed, but a few didn't, the snake screeching in agony each time. "Let it go," Mickey yelled, taking control of his host's mouth. "It's not worth chasing." Before anyone even had the chance to register his words, a colossal shadow flew through the jungle, slicing every tree in its path like a giant's machete, heading straight toward the group. Mickey barely got Marnock to duck, scarcely registering that 2 others had done the same. Their 3 companions weren't so lucky, the snake's tail slamming into them more violently than its heads ever had, causing their upper bodies to burst into minced meat. Fountains of blood sprayed out of their severed torsos, as a rain of dirt, splintered wood, fragmented shells, and gore showered what was left of the jungle. By the time Marnock, Flammy, and the sailor with the red bandana raised their heads, the green snake was long gone, the midday sun shining brightly over the uprooted section of the jungle that stretched for dozens of meters around them. Not wasting a moment, Mickey took control of his host's body, darting toward a certain direction while yelling at the others. "Run toward the lake!" Abandoning all caution, Mickey sprinted toward the lake at full speed, the other survivors right behind his host. It was too late for stealth anyway, given the commotion that their battle against the two-headed snake had raised. On top of that, they most certainly lacked the numbers to protect themselves against any other horrors that the jungle might throw at them, so their best bet was to avoid them entirely. Hopefully the monstrous serpent had scared the other beasts off. The group had already covered most of the distance to the tomb, so it shouldn't take them very long to arrive at this pace. "Can't believe we lost 200 men in 3 days," Marnock said, his heart still racing. "Just how unlucky can one get?" "I don't think it was all luck." Mickey mentally shook his head, though he didn't bother to elaborate. Nobody said anything else, the 3 men rushing through the jungle, this time keeping an eye up at the trees' crowns in case there were more snakes lying in wait. Fortunately, they managed to reach the circular lake where the saint's treasure was supposedly buried without encountering any other creatures. Technically, there was a chance that they'd lost their way in their hurry and ended up at the wrong lake, though Mickey doubted that was the case. The other bodies of water were much farther away, so he and his companions wouldn't have reached a different lake this soon. As for whether the demigod's tomb was truly hidden here, he had no idea. None of the deceased sailors had been certain either. Mickey didn't even know how deep the lake was, or whether any aquatic creatures lurked inside its seemingly tranquil waters, as their intel hadn't included that information. The only thing he could tell was how wide it was, a couple kilometers across. Even if the treasure was here, finding it wasn't going to be easy. Things would have been simpler if they had arrived with hundreds of men as originally planned. Listening to the persistent coughs of their companions, Mickey remembered that his host was supposed to be faking his illness too. Then again, it didn't really matter at this point. The sailor with the red bandana was breathing and coughing a lot harder than Flammy. It hadn't been that long since he fell sick, but straining himself during the previous battle must have greatly worsened his condition. The island's humidity probably wasn't making things easy for him either. "Need some help, Nodar?" Flammy asked. The healer hadn't done as much as the others during the battle. Most of the snake's blows had been lethal anyway. By the time they connected, there was nothing left to heal. That said, he seemed more than happy to contribute his life mana after the fact, as always. Nodar gestured for the man to proceed, prompting Mickey to do something that none of the sailors could have expected. Taking control of his host's cores, he allowed a huge amount of air and water mana to spill out of his body, and to mix into a layer of frost that spread toward the healer. "Don't touch him," Mickey yelled as a pale sheet of ice covered Flammy's feet, freezing him in place. He didn't stop there, however, crystalline tendrils coiling around the healer's legs and torso, making crackling sounds as they restrained him further. Flammy tried to resist, of course, but the tendrils only grew thicker as they wrapped around his body, soon binding his arms and even covering his mouth. "Marnock, what in the reefs are you doing?" Cough and how they... Nodar began to say before gasping mid-sentence, his eyes widening with realization. "Y've a second mana core." "Stay away from him," Mickey insisted, making no effort to imitate his host's accent anymore. Meanwhile, Marnock didn't seem particularly happy about this turn of events either. "Mickey, mind explainin' why you're attacking me made all of a sudden?" he asked, trying to take back control of his body. Mickey sighed. Stirring the spectral fiends slumbering inside his wisp, he used their help to strengthen his hold on his vessel against the man's wishes. "It's him," he said out loud for everyone's sake, his voice calm and confident. "Flammy's the one who's infected the whole crew. I'm willing to bet good money that he was behind the shipwreck too." Marnock's resistance eased slightly, his soul flaring with disbelief, though Mickey could tell via their connection that his host was still more inclined to side with his friend than him. Nodar didn't appear very convinced either. That's a serious accusation, Marnock. Ave ya Nathan to back this up. I know more about the life affinity than most people, Mickey replied, scrambling to decide how to best phrase what he was about to say. I've come across a family with multiple life users in the past. They could use it for more than just healing. That ain't proof, Nodar said. No, it isn't, Mickey agreed, which is why I didn't say anything sooner, even though I've had my suspicions for a while. But I've been paying attention to Flammy over the past couple of days, and everyone he healed coincidentally started coughing shortly afterwards. Just think about it for a moment. Aren't you the same? Nodar creased his brow, clearly taking Mickey's words seriously for the first time in this conversation. Even Marnock stopped trying to forcefully reclaim his body, finally willing to at least hear Mickey out. Cough, what about ya? Then? Nodar asked. Couldn't help but notice you stopped cuffin' the moment that thing attacked us. Were you pretendin' all along? I was protecting myself, Mickey said, not a hint of apology in his voice. He tried to infect me the moment I made it to shore, but I accidentally got rid of his mana due to reasons that aren't relevant. It took me a while to piece together what had happened, but I realized that he'd try to infect me again, so I've been rejecting all his subsequent offers to heal me. So what? Nodar pressed. You didn't ave to lie to us. What choice did I have? Mickey shrugged. When he started faking his own cough, I realized that he was planning to single me out. I would have been the one who looked suspicious if I'd been the last healthy person in the group. I still didn't have any evidence to prove that he had infected everyone or that he was faking his own cough, but he couldn't prove that I was faking mine either. What's changed? You still don't have New York concrete proof, so why did you stop doing it? Well, believe it or not, playing Flammy's little game was the last thing on my mind while we were getting butchered by a green beast. And, frankly, I no longer give a shit now that it's just the three of us. I can handle him just fine, so I could have waited for him to kill you, but I thought I'd do you the courtesy of letting you know. What about the second core? Cough? Or you speakin' differently all of a sudden? I don't mind giving you a detailed explanation about all of that, but I promise you that it has nothing to do with any of this. I'm not sure you even have the time to hear me out. Nodar fell silent, seemingly contemplating everything Mickey had said. However, Marnock clearly had a few more questions for him. This still doesn't make sense. I've known Flammy for decades. I've met his family. His boy calls me uncle. Why in the reefs would he do this to us? That much is obvious, Mickey replied with a mental shrug. I don't know if he's been lying to you the whole time or just recently decided to stab you in the back, but he clearly wants all the fool's amber to himself. That's stupid. We ain't even sure it exists. And he couldn't ave known he'd survive this long. He could ave died a dozen times over. Mickey scratched the back of his host's head. I admit it's the one thing I haven't been able to figure out. It's one of the reasons I've waited so long to tell even you. But I'm pretty sure about the rest. He didn't think that it was a coincidence that nearly every person Flammy had touched had ended up falling sick and getting killed in the very next battle. But the man's motivations indeed didn't add up. Flammy could have drowned in the shipwreck or gotten picked off by the aquatic monsters while swimming to the island, and he could have just as easily gotten killed by the crabs or the green snake. They didn't even know whether the demigod's tomb was here, nor did Flammy have the means to survive on the island by himself after getting rid of everyone else. It would have been safer for him to betray his crewmates during the return trip, after they'd confirmed the amber's existence and helped him claim it. And even if, by some miracle, he managed to get off the island with all the treasure, how was he going to escape from the Greenborns ruling the oceans long enough to use it? It almost felt like the man's greed had robbed him of every trace of common sense, leading him to make all sorts of idiotic choices, gambling his life at every turn. Let him speak. Cough. I want to hear what he has to say, Nodar said after a while. Mickey complied since he was just as curious as the others. He unsealed Flammy's mouth, only to reveal the world's creepiest grin. Much like Mickey had warned Marnock and Nodar, their healer no longer bothered to cough. More importantly, He made no effort to deny the accusations or defend his actions, nor did he look very concerned that his treachery had been unveiled. He merely stared at his former companions, his eyes as still as the lake they reflected, with just the faintest glint of mirth simmering in their depths. Nothing? Cough? Is everything Marnock cough, said about you true? Nodar asked, his coughs growing more frequent by the second. Flammy! Tell 'em they're wrong, Marnock suddenly yelled, Mickey allowing him to use his body again. Silence. Nodar raised an eyebrow upon registering Marnock's sudden change in tone, but Flammy didn't show the slightest reaction to his friend's outburst, nor to anything else that had been spoken earlier. Not until a couple of seconds later at least, when he turned to face Nodar directly. Ignoring the tight restraints, he shifted within the ice, his bones audibly cracking in the process. The grating noise made every hair on Marnock's body stand on end, though the healer didn't seem to even feel the pain. Flammy's core flared with mana, making Mickey realize that something was wrong. Countless veins squirmed beneath Nodar's skin, the poor sailor clenching his chest in agony as he fell to his knees. His throat and chin turned purple and swollen, blood pouring out of every orifice in his body. Damn! Stop this or I swear I'll kill you, Mickey yelled, but the life mage didn't so much as flinch. Mickey used the icy vines to constrict the healer tighter, but Flammy didn't seem to care about his misshapen body or the countless wounds tearing open across his skin. Nodar was having a much harder time enduring the violent symptoms of his infection, however. Bloody foam spilled out of his lips as he struggled to speak or breathe. Mickey wasn't sure which, but only choked gargles escaped his mouth. Before long, he was convulsing on the ground, clawing desperately at the dirt and his own neck, trying to dig a hole to inhale through. Yet his flesh only swelled further to seal his self-inflicted wounds. Realizing that Flammy wasn't going to let the poor man go, Mickey formed an icy javelin in his hands, pointing it at his host's friend. He didn't know whether the healer's death would release Nodar, but he had no idea what else to try. Marnock didn't even try to stop him this time. Perhaps he'd fully accepted that Flammy was no longer the person he once knew, or maybe he was simply too shaken by the pointless cruelty transpiring before his very eyes. Just as Mickey fired the construct, veins squirmed beneath Flammy's mutilated skin too, his body turning red like a ripe tomato, in a manner that reminded Mickey of his Troll's Fury potions. The healer's muscles flexed with new power, shattering his restraints as he smashed the projectile with his backhand. At the same time, life mana flooded his body to mend his wounds. Of course, Flammy's injuries were way too serious to be fixed in an instant, even after emptying his core. His half-repaired bones broke again with every step he took, cutting through his own flesh as he charged at Mickey on all fours like a wild beast, leaving bloody footprints and palm prints on the frozen ground. Whether his goal was to rip Marnock apart with his bare hands, bite his throat out like a rabid dog, or just infect and watch him suffer the same fate as Nodar, Mickey didn't know nor care. Either way, he didn't panic, knowing that he was stronger and far more collected than the injured healer. Flammy had only possessed half of Marnock's mana reserves to start with, and he'd already wasted a lot to worsen Nodar's injuries, to free himself from the ice, and to fight against his self-inflicted wounds. More ice spilled out of Marnock's body, a new layer of frost reaching Flammy, this one even thicker than before. Tendrils sprouted to stop the healer in his tracks once again, the man's face coming to a halt mere centimeters from his former friends. Flammy's eyes had remained perfectly placid throughout, no matter what he'd done or what had happened to him, almost as if his mind was no longer even present, his body acting entirely on its own. Mickey had to admit that he was more than a little disturbed by the sight, even though he knew that the healer didn't pose much of a threat to him. Not giving up, the life mage spat out a mouthful of infected blood into Marnock's eyes, or tried to. Anyway, though Mickey had seen that coming from a kilometer away, having already coated his host's face with a film of water. Shifting his attention back to Nodar, he realized that the man was already dead. Sighing, he was about to finish the incapacitated healer off, when another change occurred in the man's body. His throbbing veins suddenly expanded once again, this time turning pitch black. The dark color snaked toward Flammy's face before spilling into his eyes, a black cloud soon covering his scaras. Mickey instinctively took a few steps back, no longer sure what he was dealing with. Everything the healer had done up to that point could be explained by a life mage that had lost his mind due to greed, but they were quickly delving into stranger territory. It was a good thing that he'd put some distance from the man too, because Flammy vomited another mouthful of blood the very next instant, once again trying to infect his friend. Only, this time, the liquid was viscous and black like tar, a series of disturbing shapes writhing inside the blob. Mickey intercepted the attack with a blast of pressurized air, only for the scattered droplets to move again by themselves the moment they landed on the ground. They formed a swarm of tiny insects, beetles? Or scarabs, perhaps? The nasty creatures, if they could even be called that, flew at Mickey, trying to worm their way into his host's body. Gritting his borrowed teeth, Mickey blocked them again with a screen of water, trapping them in the clear liquid. The scarabs didn't give up, however, turning back into droplets that tried to swim right through the azure barrier. Not gonna happen, Mickey spat, gathering and rolling the mana into a globule as big as a watermelon, making sure that he pulled every last drop of filth to its center. Scanning it with his mana sense, he soon confirmed that this thing didn't have a mana core of any sort, something that every living being in the universe was supposed to need. Then again, he wasn't sure whether spectral fiends had any either. He'd never thought to check. Nor did he know whether they counted as living creatures. Whatever the case, the tar-like material trapped before him looked nothing like them either. Another demonic infestation? He wondered. They're much more common than I thought. How many clones had he even sent out in total? 4? 500? And this was already his third time running into a world like this. Of course, every infestation he'd encountered had manifested in an entirely different way, but the similarities were uncanny. Could this have something to do with Robari's gods killing each other and ruining their only source of stable beast mana? He asked both himself and his host. Marnock remained silent, clearly still too shocked to utter a word. Even Mickey was too tired to solve the mystery right now, and way too freaked out by the weird substance to keep watching it wriggling inside the azure bubble. Pouring some air mana into the construct, he froze it completely before shattering it into powder, as fine as he could make it. Just to be sure, he stomped on both the pale and black dust indiscriminately, before freezing everything into an even larger block of ice that would hopefully last for several hours before melting. If that wasn't enough, he used more ice mana to drill a deep pit into the ground, burying the construct and sealing it with mud. Turning to Flammy, he realized that the crazed sailor was somehow still alive. Whether it was his life affinity or his ailment keeping him breathing wasn't clear, though the man had reduced himself to a shriveled mummy, too weak to fight against his new prison. Even so, he was clearly trying, and thankfully failing, to gather more of the dark blood to vomit out. Not interested in finding out whether the healer would eventually succeed, Mickey froze him completely into a statue before giving his corpse the same treatment as the bugs. Was it a little over the top? Probably, especially given the fact that he was borrowing Marnock's body to pulverize his friends. Still, Mickey knew that these demonic infestations could bring even gods to their knees. Robari had been even more developed than Amenthus, and had still suffered greatly, so he wasn't going to leave anything up to chance. Only after separating and burying the minced and twice-frozen remains of the treacherous life mage in 5 different pits did he finally exhale in relief, plopping down weakly. Marnock, I'm really sorry about your crew and your friend, and for making you watch that, he said as he tried to catch his breath. Just what was that? The last surviving sailor asked, his inner voice soft and defeated. If I'm right, something really, really nasty, Mickey replied vaguely. Have you ever heard of anything like this happening elsewhere on your planet? Marnock shook his head. Do you think I could have helped him? Had I realized sooner? He asked, clearly caring more about the people he had lost than the fate of his world. Don't even go there, Mickey said, his voice growing firmer. I'm pretty sure that whatever happened to him has been going on for a while, since before the shipwreck for sure, probably long before that. You couldn't have known, and I doubt you could have done anything about it. Marnock didn't reply immediately, though he did eventually nod a couple of minutes later. Now what? Everyone is gone. I'm the last person on the damn island. Mickey pushed his host's body back to his feet, scanning their surroundings once more. His gaze lingered on Nodar's gnarly corpse for a second, the man's expression still twisted by horror, disease, and sheer agony. They should bury him. Mickey didn't know whether the infection that had killed him had merely been the product of Flammy's life affinity or the infestation too, and he'd rather not wait long enough to find out. Besides, the poor guy deserved to be treated with some dignity in death. Either way, dealing with that shouldn't take more than a few minutes. Peering past the dead sailor, Mickey scanned the vast lake stretching before him as he answered his host's question. Unless you've reconsidered how important it is for you to stick around on this shitty planet for revenge. No offense. We're gonna have to start searching the lake. Just pray that we find your saint's tomb before we get eaten, and that the demigod has something useful buried with him. Mickey and Marnock were still shaken by the things that they had seen over the past couple of days. Sadly, they didn't have the time to rest or mourn the others. A vast jungle teeming with monsters stretched behind them, a slightly less vast lake full of unknown horrors lying before them. While the sailor was busy burying Nodar's body by the shore, Mickey seized the opportunity to refill his host's cores, contemplating the best way to proceed. Once Marnock was done paying his respects to his fallen crewmate, Mickey began crafting a new ice construct. It looked a bit like a spear, though its blade had a spiral shape, leading to an extremely pointy tip. Not satisfied with the tool's hardness, Mickey engraved a few unit cells on the ice. He kept the enchantments relatively simple, knowing that making something on par with his scythes or cloak would take too long. Even the half-assed runes he drew on the tool were bound to be quite useful, however. The structural integrity enchantments would help the construct endure the strain as it drilled into the lakebed, while the sharpness runes would allow it to pierce deeper and through tougher materials. The controlled self-repairs would not only help with the spear's maintenance but also give Mickey the ability to easily replicate it. Finally, he included rotation runes to make the construct more mana-efficient for what he intended. Mind telling me what all this is for? Marnock asked upon seeing Mickey snap the spear in two, fueling its pieces with mana to regrow them into a couple of brand new copies. It's to locate the tomb, Mickey replied, before elaborating. It would take forever for us to shovel the whole lake out by ourselves. But we don't need to. We just need to find the right spot to dig. Burying a corpse didn't require that much space. However, this wasn't just some random person's burial site. It was the final resting place of a demigod. So Mickey figured that it had to be somewhat spacious. More importantly, it had been designed either by the saint himself or his associates to weather the endless march of time and, if Marnock's information was to be believed, to hide a sizable stash of fool's amber. All things considered, Mickey felt confident that the tomb had to be several meters across at the very least, probably much larger. That meant that he wouldn't have to drill the holes too close to one another. If he spaced them out in fixed intervals, he could slowly poke around the lakebed until he found what he was looking for. To demonstrate, he grabbed one of the constructs, pouring some mana into its runes. Stabbing the ground, he allowed the tool to start spinning. Within mere seconds, the sharpened drill had pierced dozens of meters through the dirt and even the thick layer of stone beneath it. More importantly, Mickey had designed the construct to consume as little mana as possible, so that he could have a bunch of them working at once without draining his host's reserves too quickly. Like that, he should be able to search most of the lake within a couple of days. Especially since he and Marnock didn't need sleep. If they got lucky, it might not even take that long. That's good and everything. But how are we going to know that we found it? Marnock asked, clearly not entirely convinced. Well, I bet it's been enchanted to the high heavens to survive for so many years. Its ceiling should be much tougher to drill through than the surrounding stone, so we can compare how much resistance the tools encounter from one hole to the next. As soon as we run into something odd, we can keep pushing to see if there's a hollowed-out section even deeper. Marnock nodded in understanding, though he still didn't appear particularly thrilled. What Mickey had just described was merely the method to locate the tomb. They'd yet to discuss how to protect themselves from the aquatic monsters most certainly living inside the lake. Luckily, Mickey had come up with a few ideas about that too. Leaning over the edge, he dipped his host's hand into the water, channeling mana from both cores and allowing it to mix into ice. The liquid began freezing immediately, icy roots spreading out from Marnok's palm. Mickey carefully controlled the shape of the emerging constructs, having something very specific in mind. He also kept his consumption to a minimum, not in a hurry to empty his host's reserves. Taking deep breaths one after another, he made sure to refill the organs as fast as he was depleting them, to always keep them above 80% of their capacity. It was imperative to have enough mana to defend oneself while working in a potentially hostile environment like this. "Now, what are you doing?" Marnok asked again, sounding genuinely curious rather than critical. "Y'all never freeze the whole lake like this." "Of course not," Mickey replied. "But lowering the temperature enough to make it unpleasant for its inhabitants should be manageable." The sailor creased his brow, probably finding even that to be overly ambitious. The lake was a couple of kilometers across, and they didn't even know how deep it was. Even if Mickey kept pouring mana into the water for weeks, he'd never be able to cool the whole lake down fast enough to matter. However, Marnok still had no idea what Mickey was capable of. Shaping the ice into a thick, square slab thrice as large as his host, Mickey allowed it to float to the surface. Hopping on it, he confirmed that it was big enough to support a person's weight without sinking, and wide enough for him to balance on it with relative ease. Getting off again, he began drawing enchantments on the slab, the runes mostly resembling the ones he'd adorned the drills with. Only, he swapped the sharpness and rotation runes with adaptive, controlled heating enchantments. He didn't stop after the first layer either. With the help of his scribing trait, he carefully arranged the unit cells into an even larger controlled heating enchantment that spanned the entire surface of the slab. Satisfied with his handiwork, he then broke the construct in half, using mana and water to grow more floating platforms. Scattering the blocks of ice in a circular area with a diameter of a couple dozen meters, he spread them out into an intricate formation, once again using his spectral trait as his guide. As soon as the fiend inside his wisp was happy with his efforts, he finally began pouring mana into the slabs, fueling the numerous enchantments he'd just drawn. The smallest heating runes were the first to activate, a pale glow emanating from the constructs. The water appeared unchanged at first, but Mickey didn't doubt that it had already started cooling rapidly. It wasn't until the second layer of runes came into effect that numerous frozen tendrils emerged from the slabs, snaking beneath the surface of the water. They looked just like the ones from earlier, though they were spreading from several points at once. Mickey was still carefully rationing his host's mana, not consuming the resource any faster than he was recovering it. Yet his enchantments allowed him to get much more value out of every single drop. "Holy saints above!" Marnok exclaimed. "I never knew you could accomplish so much with runecraftin'." Mickey grinned. "You haven't seen anything yet." As if on cue, the pale roots interlocked under both his conscious and subconscious control, completing the final rune in the formation. 3 layers of enchantments complemented one another, working in unison to accelerate the freezing process. The air around Marnok instantly chilled, sending a shiver down the poor sailor's spine. A downside of fusing 2 common mana types from separate cores into their composite affinity was that it didn't grant their owner as much resistance to the resulting element. Thankfully, Marnok's 2 yellow cores had strengthened his body enough to endure the leakage of the formation without much trouble. "I can see where your confidence stems from," he admitted. "I'm still not sure this'll be enough, though." "It will be," Mickey insisted. "We don't need to freeze the whole lake. Just chill one section at a time to drive the beasts away." Obviously, Marnok was far weaker than Kassereth, making it impossible for Mickey to unleash a formation on par with the one that he had used in the tournament. His current host only possessed about a fifth of the Thescalin's reserves, and the lake was much larger than the stadium, not to mention filled with water rather than air. Even so, if he were to split the place into, say, 10 smaller regions and take his sweet time channeling mana into each one, he should be able to lower the water's temperature by several degrees, giving him and Marnok space to start digging. The lack of a domain also prevented him from preparing the formation in an instant, But that wasn't a problem in a drawn-out operation like this. Finally, he'd made sure that both the slabs and the spears he had crafted were highly mobile, so it wouldn't be difficult to move from one spot to the next. Marnock whistled in appreciation once Mickey was done explaining his plan in detail, though he still had some questions. How do you know the beasts will swim away instead of attacking us? Well, I don't, Mickey admitted. But imagine that you're a dumb animal and your environment suddenly gets freezing cold. Would your first instinct be to go around looking for a mage that might be causing it, or just to leave for somewhere more comfortable? And remember that these beasts might have never even come across sapience before. Marnock nodded, yet Mickey wasn't done. Some of the creatures might still attack us, so help me keep an eye out. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our drills can be used as weapons, and I'm confident that we can handle a few isolated creatures here and there. They'll help us restock on food too. They still had most of Mickey's rations, as well as a lot of leftover crab meat from the day before that they had frozen and stored inside the spatial seal. It should be more than enough to last Marnock for weeks. On top of that, all three of Marnock's affinities were excellent for surviving in an inhospitable environment for a long time. He could conjure drinking water and breathable air, in addition to preserving food for months. That said, they had no idea what awaited them inside the tomb, so having some extra food wouldn't hurt. Happy with their plan, the two said nothing else, commencing their operation. Whether the saint's tomb was truly here or not, they were going to turn the lake upside down searching for it. Channeling his host's mana through the constructs, Mickey rapidly filled the gaps between the enchanted slabs with more ice. A frozen island formed beneath Marnock's feet, encasing the entire formation in mere moments before continuing to expand outwards. Blooming like a pale lotus, it disturbed the lake's still waters, growing to thrice its original width in less than half an hour. Only then did its expansion begin to slow down, the complex flow of mana reaching a delicate equilibrium. Marnock's cores absorbed water and air mana as fast as they were expelling it, essentially leaving his reserves untouched. At the same time, the frozen island was large enough that chunks kept tearing off its perimeter as quickly as new liquid was solidifying to join it, preventing the island from growing any larger. This created the illusion that Mickey's efforts had stopped yielding results. But he knew that couldn't be further from the truth. Examining the area around the island, he saw countless discarded pieces of ice floating away, like a river of peeled petals. He was willing to bet that the water was still growing colder by the second too. If stacking so many runes together is working so well, why don't you add more layers to the formation? Marnock suddenly asked. It's not that simple, Mickey said, mentally shaking his head. The enchantments make the cooling process more efficient, but I still need to keep fueling all the small runes. You don't have enough mana for a fourth layer, and I can't control too many separate streams at once either, nor can I send your mana too far from us. The configuration that Mickey was currently using was already several times simpler than the one he had unleashed on Thescala, yet fully activating it while being mindful of his host's expenditure was still difficult and time-consuming. Even so, Mickey was more than satisfied with its output. By nightfall, he was confident that he had driven away all the living creatures in their immediate surroundings. The absence of sunlight would hopefully help the lake stay cool for longer too, giving him ample time to begin his search in earnest. He wasn't exactly thrilled to do so in the dark, but he understood that the operation was never going to be perfectly safe, no matter what he did. Sighing, he ripped the enchanted slabs out of the island's surface, stacking them on a tall pile by its edge for later. Next, he grabbed the magical spears from the other pile, setting them vertically in various spots across the island, their tips pointing downwards. Pouring mana into the rotation runes, he allowed the tools to drill through ice, water, mud, and stone alike, leaving one narrow hole after the other on the lakebed. Moving around the island methodically, he scanned the area beneath it for any signs of unexpected resistance. Another 20 minutes later, he was done with the frozen region entirely, coming up empty-handed. Still, he knew that his little island only constituted a tiny fraction of the first section of the lake that he intended to explore. Returning to the stack of slabs, he tossed them out into the water, freezing their edges together into a makeshift raft. Hopping on, He willed the constructs to move, sailing through the lake while continuing to poke at its depths with his magical drills. He was mindful not to move too far from the formation, lest he ventured into warmer waters by mistake. Searching everything in a wide circle around the island took him the better part of the night, though he sadly had nothing to show for it by morning. Oh well, we were never going to find it on the first try, he thought with a shrug, consoling both himself and his host. Stopping at a different location, he allowed the raft to split into its components again, repeating his earlier actions to form a second island. The rising sun didn't make his life easy, slowing down the expansion. However, his efforts from the previous day most certainly did. Looking back, Mickey saw that the first island was still there. It had shrunk slightly, but it looked like it would be a few days before it melted completely. That's good, he thought. Every region will go a little faster than the previous one. He wasn't sure whether he would manage to freeze the entire lake at some point, or whether he would hit diminishing returns and never exceed a certain volume of ice. Either way, it didn't really matter. At his current pace, he'd be done exploring the lake in a week anyway. Mickey and his host continued to search one region after another, averaging 2 new islands per day. Of course, Mickey was doing most of the work, but Marnock still found various ways to contribute. He helped pour mana into the enchantments, took care of their bodily needs, and kept an eye out for any attacking beasts. A few aquatic creatures did try sneaking up on them every now and then, but the only thing they accomplished was to add to Mickey's stash of frozen food. Having learned his lesson a long time ago, he'd rather not break his host's teeth on yellow meat, but they'd thankfully slaughtered plenty of orange beasts too. The frogs are still going to the very back of the queue, he told his host on the 4th day, preferring to feast on just about anything else before he resorted to the raw amphibians. While Mickey and Marnock had settled into a productive routine, they still remained tense throughout the operation, the threat of a green beast constantly looming over their head. Mickey didn't know whether he could handle one by himself with his current means, and he didn't want to find out either. If there were any such monsters in the water, and that was looking increasingly unlikely, then Mickey's plan of forcing them away from their habitat had clearly worked like a charm. However, it was entirely possible that the beasts would lose their patience at some point if he kept chasing them around, so he was really hoping that they would find the tomb before it came to that. The good news was that no land-dwelling creatures had bothered them. Even if they'd tracked them down to the lake, they clearly had no interest in swimming toward Mickey's raft. By the 6th day, Mickey and Marnock were beginning to lose all hope. They'd already explored over 80% of the lake, finding no sign of the demigod's resting place. There was a chance that it was located in the tiny area that they had yet to search, but there was also a much greater chance that they had missed it, or worse, that it wasn't here at all. Now what? The sailor asked, his voice gloomy. I don't know, Mickey said. If we fail to find it in the last 2 areas, our only option is to start over. Maybe they'd get lucky if they drilled even deeper, shrunk the intervals between the holes, or just paid more attention. As long as they didn't provoke some green monster in the process, their supplies would last. However, searching the lake more thoroughly would inevitably take a lot more time. If that didn't work either, they'd have to try a different lake, hoping that Marnock's information hadn't been entirely baseless. The problem was that they'd need to trek through the jungle by themselves to get there, which was practically suicide. As for escaping the island or surviving here indefinitely, those were even more unrealistic options. Mickey may have originally come here looking for a quick vacation, but he wasn't going to leave Marnock alone in such a hellish place. So he'd have to find an acceptable solution for his friend before returning to Remir. Maybe he'll reconsider moving to the vault if we run out of alternatives, he hoped. Just as Mickey was trying to think of the best way to breach the topic again, one of his drills hit something hard, halting its descent. He didn't immediately think much of it, guessing that he had probably just poured too little mana into the construct, weakening its momentum. It wouldn't be his first blunder this week. Yet, his borrowed heart skipped a beat as soon as he recharged the tool and still struggled to pierce deeper, and then a second time once his host came to the same realization as him. Do you think? Marnock asked, clearly too afraid to jump to conclusions. Technically, it could just be a naturally occurring vein of some harder mineral inhibiting the tool, though they hadn't found anything of the sort over the past few days. Only one way to find out, Mickey said. Using several more drills, he tried to narrow down the dimensions of the suspected tomb. It soon became clear that Mickey had greatly underestimated how large the structure was, though that had admittedly been on purpose, to make sure that they didn't let it slip through their fingers by mistake. Either way, it was a square over 30 meters across, its clear-cut shape further evidence that it was artificial. Mickey's constructs could still penetrate the ceiling with enough effort, but he didn't rush to break in just yet. Flooding the tomb would only make their subsequent exploration harder. Instead, he arranged the enchanted slabs above the structure, spending the next 30 minutes activating the formation again and freezing every drop of water separating them from their destination. This was one of the deepest spots they'd searched so far, the lake bed about 12 meters from the surface, the ceiling of the suspected tomb another 5 meters of stone below that. Once everything was ready, Mickey dug a tunnel wide enough for Marnock to crawl through, reaching the enchanted layer in less than a minute. Their heart thrummed wildly the more certain they grew that this was indeed the place that hundreds of Marnock's crewmates had lost their lives searching for. And it's all ours for the taking, Mickey thought, rubbing his host's hands with anticipation.